This happened to me back in 2008 when I was 14, so my memory is a little fuzzy. My mom, brother, and I drove deep into the sticks of Tennessee from Texas to visit. We were only staying for the weekend. My mom, aunt, and grandmother were talking, and I don't know how we got to this conversation, but my aunt was telling me how she heard about this abandoned church that was supposedly haunted. If you went to the church and took the stick that kept the door closed and put it somewhere else, when you came back, it would be in its original place. There was a statue of an angel, and if you shined a light in its eyes at night, they would bleed. She was spending the night at a friend's house, and her friend also had another friend over that she wasn't familiar with. Her two friends decided to go out to this church at night, in the early hours of the morning. It was pitch black because it's out in the country. They lay a Ouija board on the truck and start asking questions. Basically, some spirit named John says that he was murdered by a gunshot some year in the early 1800s. I swear in this town there are more dead people than there are alive people. I don't actually know that, but it sure seems like it. The last question that they asked was, "Where are you?" and the planchette flew off the board. They decided they didn't want to look for it. Part of me wonders if it's still at the church and where it would be. So they checked the gravestones nearby and found John. Then they thought that they heard a gunshot and ran back to the truck and went home. I said I wanted to go to the church. She took me, my brother, and my cousin who were the same age. It was about a 45-minute drive to get there, and the road that it was on was empty, nothing but grass. There was no way that you could walk there. Across the street was a field that went on for miles, and on either side of the church was just grass and trees. No streetlights. So when we get there, it's a one-room, white little church. It's surrounded by trees toward the outside of the fence. The fence was black iron, and the opening was big enough for trucks to come through. We saw the creepy angel statue that my aunt had mentioned. We thought it looked like the Reaper. We pull up, and the gate is already open. Immediately, my brother and my cousin, who were in the back seat, were like, "Oh no, we are not going in there." And my aunt was saying, "Why is the gate open? I just don't understand." And I had my hand on the handle, and I looked at the gate, and I knew that something was waiting for me on the other side. I could see, maybe my mind made it up, but I didn't see it with my physical eyes. A ghostly white man with yellow, crooked teeth maliciously smiling at me. So I take my hand off the handle and say, "Okay, I want to go home." So my aunt backed out and went down the road a little bit further, and the closest thing next to us to turn around at, because there were little ditches on the side of the road in case it rains, was another graveyard. Not surprising. We passed by the church, and I wasn't expecting her to stop, but she did to take a photo with a digital camera, and the door was open to the church. We were all freaked out, and I swear I had this feeling like we needed to leave because something was going to chase us. When we got home, the three of us couldn't stop looking at the camera. The thing I remembered the most was that the treetops grew into a face. It looked like a big bald man with a crooked nose and a narrow chin. When my aunt got the picture developed, there were 4 orbs. 1 by the gate, 1 by the door, and 2 by the window. My brother and cousin swore that they had seen green eyes looking out of that window. I didn't sleep that night. I felt like something was hovering over me, waiting for me to fall asleep. I kept praying that nothing would happen. I tried watching TV to shake it off, but damn, there was no shaking it. I didn't sleep until I got back to Texas. That was my last night in Tennessee, and when I went back home, I slept with my light on every night for a while. And while we were there, I could just sense this unbelievable amount of hate from whatever was there. It was so aggressive and ready to attack. That feeling just pierced through you. That's my only experience. I will never doubt that there is a spirit world after that. My aunt sent me the picture, but I tore it up in 2012 because I was afraid that it would bring something bad into the house. This happened to me a while back when I decided to go on another camping trip alone. I always liked camping alone. There's something serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I always found it relaxing. So I planned out what trail that I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped in my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles in until I find the right spot and head off the trail to find a place to set up my tent. I stumble upon this nice-sized clearing and decide that it's a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I'm exhausted at this point, but set up the tent at the southernmost edge of the clearing next to the tree line and manage to get a fire going. I roast some weenies and start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noise. It sounded like an animal, most likely a deer with a lame leg, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking, kind of dragging noise. I felt bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't really go find it and put it out of its misery. I think nothing of it after that, and go about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent and insert myself into my sleeping bag. I decide that even in my exhausted and relaxed state, I can't go to sleep, so I pull out a book that I brought with me and start to read by the light of my lamp. Hours go by and I hear the sound again, this time closer, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and listen to this animal walk/drag across the clearing toward my tent. It was really loud at this point, and now it sounds as if the hooves are being really heavily planted, with the dragging noise following seconds after, like the deer is dragging something along behind it. It makes it to about what I assume is the middle of the clearing and stops, and I hear nothing. No breathing. I mean, not a sound from this animal. I unzip the tent and look into the clearing. Nothing but trees and darkness. What on earth? Unnerved at this point, I zip the tent back up and sit there listening for other noises. There was just crickets and the breeze. I decide that there are a lot of strange noises in the woods, and I tried to not let it bother me. Besides, I did have my rifle. I start to doze off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right, followed by women's laughter and sticks snapping off to my left. I'm up now, wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I'm hearing or just a product of being half asleep. Then I hear more faint laughing from a couple other different directions, all sounding like different people, and confirm that this is real. The noises are closing in, and I grab my rifle, preparing to fire off a warning shot into the air in case they come too close. Something about this laughter, how far in the woods that I was, the noise earlier, and the time of night, told me that this was not just another family strolling through. I was on edge enough already, but then I noticed that the nightlife was dead quiet. Not even the wind was making any noise. I decided enough was enough. I unzipped the tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line, seeing nothing. I listened intently to my surroundings. There was no more laughing, and the forest sounds had returned. I relaxed just a bit, and figuring that I had scared whoever off, I sat down, and in my exhausted state, I fell asleep. I woke up later in a cold sweat, racked with anxiety, and it was still dark outside. I immediately hear two people whispering, not very far from my tent. Alert, I grab my rifle again and listen to what they were saying. I can't make out much, but I hear something about being lost, so I shout, "Hey, who's there?" The voices fall silent. I call out again, "Are you guys lost?" Who's there?" Suddenly a huge burst of flame, like a flamethrower, erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people that were just standing around. In shock, I fire my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and it goes dark. Without checking my surroundings, I get up and sprint out of my tent, making a hard left back to where the trail was. I hiked until sunrise, back to my truck with my head over my shoulder the entire way. I never heard anyone follow me. I never saw anyone or anything the entire time, but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After that, my enjoyment of camping alone left me. I left all my gear in the woods that night. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was in the spring of 1998 when I was 14. My Boy Scout troop went camping in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop were people that I'd known my whole life, and we were all very close and knew each other very well and trusted one another. We had been hiking for 5 days or so, and it was miserable. It rained every day, and we were all exhausted and sore and hungry and covered with blisters. The adults realized that we had bitten off more than we could chew in trying to hike a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather, so we had changed course and gotten off the trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground. It was the kind of place with hookups for RVs, picnic tables, it had fire pits and grills, and a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or another house. There may have been a few other small groups, but if there were, we never interacted with or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet, and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark, and we had finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including my friend Jeremy, who, like everyone else in our group, I had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods up a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and after 10 or 15 minutes, followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind, pre-LED. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance through the woods. I heard a noise to my left, and I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet away off the trail. There was a strange light around him, like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods. I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of sad, and he said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, my friends were all in there, and I heard Jeremy talking from in the shower. All the blood drained out of my head, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were really freaked and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them what had happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot, but this was long before any of us had ever experimented with any mind-altering substance. Regardless, I could tell that they believed me. Like I said, we had known each other forever, and knew when one of us was exaggerating or playing a joke. We all waited together until everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth, and then walked back together in complete silence. When we got to the spot that I had seen, whoever he was gone without a trace. The water pump was still there, though. No one had noticed it before, because it was a ways off the trail and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed really scared. I remember not sleeping much that night. In all the years since then, I've never been able to figure out what occurred. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? Unlikely. Did I hallucinate it? Also unlikely. So who's to say? When I was around 15 or so, my mom and stepfather got divorced in a pretty dramatic way. It's like the whole household was just turned upside down. Everyone's routines were off. Mom was out doing something most nights after work, my little sister spent more time with her friends, and I became something of a night owl, usually waiting until the wee morning hours to lie down. Our house was a simple one in a rural area. 2 stories, with a huge backyard sharing a fence with a cow pasture and the entrance to some thick woods. The house had a lot of problems, but I enjoyed taking over the maintenance and gardening work as they gave me something to do when I was feeling depressed. For some perspective, our kitchen windows looked out directly to the fence described above. The left half of the fence bordered one of the back corners of the big cow pasture, while the right half bordered the entrance to the woods, which had a rather overgrown trailhead just barely visible from the kitchen window. For the most part, though, all you could see was overgrown grass and shrubbery, at least 4 or 5 feet high, and some low-hanging trees of mixed oak and cedar. This backdrop added a sort of eerie tranquility to our property, which I appreciated from the first day we moved in. One night, I took a break from my homework after realizing I had stayed up way too late on a Thursday, even for my standards. I went downstairs to make some food, and my dog followed me like she always did. I made a grilled cheese, and while I was at the sink cleaning the pan, I noticed some of the grass from the wood line start to shuffle around. It startled me at first, but as soon as I began to fixate on it, I saw no more disturbance. We lived in wildlife country at the time, so I figured it was probably a deer, coyote, or a cougar. Unsurprising for the latter, given that the farmer who owned the pasture had dozens of cows and sometimes didn't bring them in at night. Strangely, though, I noticed this for several more nights, always when I was doing the dishes after eating. I would look out the window, see the grass shuffle around, then see nothing further when I fixated on the spot. I was always a fan of scary movies, and I tended to be a jumpy kid, so each time I convinced myself I wasn't really seeing any sort of pattern. This changed, though, when my dog would start fixating on the woods herself and barking at night. Furthermore, our motion sensor security light would begin to stay activated sometimes for hours on end, only switching off when I would get to the kitchen to make my midnight snacks. Eventually, I told my mom about all this, and while she initially seemed concerned, she pointed out that we did live behind the woods after all, and so we should expect animals or occasional homeless squatters near our property. She said that if I was concerned, I could always call the police or animal control. I didn't disagree, and for the most part gave the matter no further thought. One night, though, I decided that a 1 a.m. dip in our hot tub in the backyard sounded good. I changed, and my dog and I went outside. I climbed in, closed my eyes, and zoned out like usual. I was whipped awake when I heard a loud crunch, followed by what sounded like someone falling over into some bushes. I stood up, turned around, and shouted, "Who's there?" But no one replied. It was dead silent, and I had the creeps. I put my robe on and went inside. The next day I told my neighbor friend and crush about this, and she thought I was being ridiculous, but nonetheless agreed to go with me to check out that part of the woods to see if there was any evidence of anyone or anything hiding in the direction that I had heard the noise coming from. We stomped through the woods until we got to where we could see the back of my house. We checked every shrub and every blackberry bush, but found nothing. It was probably a coyote or something deciding on whether or not you'd make a good dinner, the neighbor girl said, snarking. I playfully flipped her off, then laughed, quietly relieved that there was no creepy person stalking me the previous night. Well, of course, I might have been wrong about that. Because that night, when I was making my usual sandwich, our security light came on, and I raced to the back door to see what was up. I saw what I could barely make out to be a shadowy, 6-foot-tall or so figure disappear from the trail and into the brush to the right of it. My heart skipped a beat, and my dog, probably sensing my nerves, began barking wildly. I opened the door and shouted, "The fuck's out there? Come out!" Of course, there was nothing but silence. After sitting in the dining room for an hour, I figured that I was being paranoid and seeing what I was subconsciously afraid of being out there. I called my neighbor back and she, surprisingly, did not call me crazy and told me she would tell her dad about it in the morning. I never saw this sort of thing again, and my neighbor's dad chalked it up to being a homeless person camping out in the woods. Or, at the very most, a stalker from one of the houses around ours. Something he explained wouldn't be surprising as my sister was quite a looker, and he thought it made sense that she would have a stalker, as if this was supposed to make me feel better. Well, I suppose it did in the end, as months passed and I forgot about it fairly quickly. That is, until a local news bulletin came out about a sexual predator having been recently apprehended by local police, after a report from a couple living a few houses down from us was filed about the wife being approached by the tall and gaunt man in the evening hours as she was watering her garden boxes. She said he suddenly appeared, quietly as if he were trying to sneak up on her. When she noticed him, she demanded his name, but he darted back into the woods. She called the sheriff immediately, and half an hour or so later the department combed through the woods and apprehended the man, who was hiding under a fallen tree. All the report said was that the man claimed he was living in the woods for months, surviving on snacks from a nearby gas station, and would not give a reason for why he was out there. However, he was apparently wanted for numerous sexual offenses on minors and vulnerable adults some years prior, whatever those ended up being. Now, years later, I still get uncomfortable looking into the woods at night, anywhere I live. Who can blame me? I actually laugh at this so much, but when it happens, I tend to just ignore it and be frightened. I'm agnostic, and I remember years ago that my friend used tarot cards for reading my future jobs. He said that I would work with kids, kindergarten, that I would work helping seniors, telecare, that I would work on a company that works with military fabrics, and at some point, at a church. When he said that, I laughed like, "You have read it way wrongly, my buddy. Me, working at a church? I would burn before I put a single finger there." 2, maybe 3 years have passed, and I'm working not in a normal church, but in the 2 cathedrals of my city, which are famous all around my country. Everything was okay. My job partners are nice. I have a good salary, maybe some little paranormal behavior that we didn't really have to worry about. But due to COVID-19, one of the cathedrals has been closed temporarily. One of us goes there periodically to stay, watch, and wait for the vigilant guard. There are a lot of sounds, whispers, footsteps, light shapes, hard strikes around the place with no logic that scares me a lot. There are big doors that open and close. My boss told me that I had nothing to worry about because we were in a sacred place, so I tended to just ignore it. We also have a basement where the electrical installations are. We don't have to go down there, but sometimes we have. It has white and black tunnels. There are some rooms that were for wine barrels, but the whole of its interior space and the door looks like it was trapped in history. All of the little alcoves were also used for prisoners' cells, since at one point, the ruler of the Inquisition resided there. Everything always feels so heavy down there. The whispers are louder and more often. I always try to not think about it. I usually end up thinking that I'm just suggesting to myself that I'm hearing what I'm hearing, but after watch one day, on the cameras, oh my God. It wasn't really that scary to me, but talking about this to my friend and coworker that works as a guard, he showed me what the camera of the archive room was recording in that moment. Did you play Final Fantasy? If not, don't worry. Just search how the souls look, like on the game. There were a lot of almost the same kind of flames floating there in the empty and dark room. I was like, what the hell are those? Animas? Man, this isn't serious, bro. This must be a video trick or a filter. He responded with, those things don't hurt. But he suggested to me not to go into that room alone when the sun goes down, and if I have to, knock on the door and apologize for going inside. He said that they would disappear. Of course, he says that even if I go in, I wouldn't see them just through the camera, and that they don't always appear. The scariest thing was that one day I was in the bathroom and I heard someone come in and stand in front of my toilet door. I assumed it was the archivist because he likes that specific toilet, so I said, give me a minute and the toilet is yours, but I suggest you go for a walk. Haha. There was no reply, but someone took a breath very heavily, and a shadow was clearly under the door. George? I asked. Are you all right? Again, there was no reply, and the breath and shadow behind the door continued to stay there. Oh, I get it, Robert, always trying to prank me. How'd you get into the church? Oh, you came with the boss. I started to be scary because the reply was the same. I started to get really scared because the reply was the same, but there was someone clearly behind the door, deeply, heavily breathing. I just knew that whatever I wanted to do, like if he was a thief and I tried to call the police, he would break down the door easily, and down there in that bathroom, there was not really a signal anyway. If something was going to happen, the best thing was to record all of it on my phone. I asked again who was behind the door. No one replied. I took my keys and put them inside my fist, and after I opened the door, I found nobody. Needless to say, I never went back to those toilets. It sounds dumb, but the only thing I can think to do in those moments is to mock them or tell a joke. I can't say that it works, but it feels safe. And let's add that since then, everything in the place is on silent. I don't hear singing, I don't hear laughing, I don't hear whispers anymore. This took place a few years ago. I was with my best friend and we decided to go camping at a campsite in Flagstaff named Lockett Meadow. We had taken our dogs. After a day of hiking and exploration, we played around a fire and eventually went to sleep. I awoke in the middle of the night to find this deep figure outside of our tent, burying itself into our tent. It had a weird way of hovering back and forth over my body, and my dog, who was curled up awake and not moving or making a sound, was at the bottom of my feet. I look over and see my best friend passed out, and his dog, which I'm unsure if it was awake, but clearly I was the only one between my friend and I that's experiencing this terrifying encounter. I eventually covered my head and thought about anything else that might make me fall asleep. The next day I asked my friend if he had somehow been awake through all of that. I explained what had happened. He replied no, and thought that I was just making it up. I told him maybe it was a bear, so we looked around our campsite, but couldn't find anything. No trails, no prints, nothing. We also had food out on a table near our tents, and a trash bag hung up on a broken branch, so even if it was a bear, I'm really surprised that it didn't get into any of our stuff. Either way, I remember how scared shitless I was, seeing this dark object observing our tent. Could it somehow have been the wind? A deer? Who knows? But this is just one encounter out of the whole trip. The next night we decide to camp at Beaver Creek. Mind you, we're in Arizona. Before we wanted to settle in, we explored Sedona. We drove to Oak Creek and parked our car near a trail down by the water. We took our dogs and hiked to the creek. After we finished jumping in and swimming, we dried off and were about to head out. Next thing you know, in our peripheral vision, we see a giant rock being thrown near us. It makes a huge splash in the water. We look up and don't see anything above, so we ran over stones and rocks to get a clear view of the top, and still see no one. We yell out taunts and curse words, but still heard no one running off or any kind of sound in response. When we got to our next campsite at Beaver Creek and set up, my friend told me that throughout the trip since we started in Flagstaff, he had rocks being thrown at him, right up until that giant one at Oak Creek. We looked at each other and thought that maybe someone was following behind us, messing with us. Then we sort of laughed it off and said no, that was impossible, that we were just trying to connect the dots to have it be a cool look-back adventure. Well, I'm glad that it didn't turn into a part 3, because nothing happened that night, or the next day, where we packed up and headed home with nothing more than a memory that we wanted to rationalize. I live in Oklahoma, and I'm really big into finding abandoned places and exploring them. I found out a few months ago that there is a forgotten graveyard a few minutes away from my house. I've lived in Oklahoma my whole life, and I've never even heard anyone mention this place before. So I looked it up and did more research on it to make sure that I wasn't walking into something crazy or where I could possibly be harmed. I found out that it was the site of an old schoolhouse, and that there was no marker, so people had basically just forgotten that it was even there over the years unless they had a loved one that was buried there. I waited until daylight to go just in case, because I wanted to be able to see everything around me since I was in the middle of nowhere. I ended up asking my sister if she wanted to go with me so that I wouldn't be alone. And God, am I glad that I asked her to come, because I never thought I would have saw what I did. We woke early the next morning to go before it got hot because it was summertime. It was 10 minutes away from the house, so it was an easy drive. Finding the exact location was the hard part. Once we did find it, we pulled up and got out and started to look around. The grass was all overgrown, and you couldn't really see any of the headstones anymore. We had to be super careful walking around because we didn't want to step on anyone. We explored for about an hour or so, and then we stumbled upon this opening where the old schoolhouse used to be. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it sounded like someone or something was running right at us. But there was no one else around. And mind you, again, we're in the middle of nowhere. So we stop what we're doing and back up a bit to look and see. Neither of us spook easy, so we just looked around and we didn't see anything. We decided it was getting too hot to just stand out there for much longer, and so we started walking back to the car. Again, it sounded like something or someone was running at us, but faster this time. We both took off sprinting to the car and didn't stop until we got in and locked the doors. As we sat there, I looked up more about this place, and it's known by a few people to have major activity, and it's so bad that they actually tell you not to go at nighttime. I read stories of people who said they had seen figures walking around, or someone asking them for help and then disappearing a few minutes later. I'm glad that I decided to wait until daylight, and that I asked my sister to come with me, because I don't know what I would have done if I heard someone that I couldn't even see running at me if I were alone. I've never been back to this graveyard. It actually kinda scares me to even think about going back after what happened. When, though it wasn't anything serious like some of the other stuff people had said happened to them, maybe one day I'll have the guts to return. Two years ago, I took my wife, my father, and son, then 3, to visit family in New England. They live on a small farm with buildings that date back to the 1700s, which have been restored and modernized. There's a guest house which was built around 20 years ago. My cousin is a prolific photographer, and my auntie had decorated most of the rooms in the main house and guest house with her photos. We didn't notice much about the photos in the guest house when we first arrived, probably because we were all jet-lagged. The next morning, after a sound sleep, we were sitting in the main family room eating breakfast and making plans for the day, when I noticed that my son was keeping his head down and not answering my father when he spoke to him, which was unusual, because even at that age, they were very close. I looked over to my dad, and noticed that he was sitting in front of a photo of a room in a rundown house. The room had a large window with sunlight streaming in, casting shadows across the length of the room toward a dark corner. I got an uneasy feeling from the photo, but didn't think much more of it. We finished breakfast and all got up from the table, and I noticed that my son was walking in a wide arc around the end of the table where my father had been sitting. Again, weird behavior, but I just dismissed it as a weird 3-year-old thing. Over the next day or so, I noticed him becoming more and more uneasy any time we were at the dining table, and doing whatever he could to avoid looking at that photo. I decided to ask him what was wrong, and he answered me very matter-of-factly, "The bad man in the picture is looking at me. He's very cold, and he's not nice." I looked back at the picture, and instantly got chills down my spine. There was no man in the picture, but I got the feeling that there was more to it than an empty room. I decided to ask my cousin about the picture, and she told me that it was taken at an abandoned farm a bit further upstate. It was one of her favorite places, but had always given my aunt the creeps, so it was moved to the guest house. Over the next couple of days, whenever I would ask my son about it, he said things like, "The bad man is looking at me. He doesn't like me. He wants to hurt me." I didn't think much of it, until we were going to bed one night and my son tripped and fell, seemingly for no reason, in the middle of the hall, and started crying hysterically. When I asked him if he was okay, he told me, "The bad man hurt me on the leg." I checked his leg, and sure enough, on the side of his leg, there was a large bruise that looked as if he had been struck with a blunt object. I didn't want to play into his fears, but asked him how the bad man could hurt him if he was in the photo downstairs near the table. His answer was enough for me to pack up all of our stuff and move to the main house with my aunt, uncle, cousins, and big burly housekeeper right away. He said, "He's not down there. He comes up here when we go to bed." I never found out anything more about the farm where the photo is taken, but I'm sure that there was some kind of evil presence around it. I'm 23 years old and starting to remember this shadowy figure that would appear then disappear in my old family's house. One second there would be nothing, then the next instant he would be right beside you. He didn't have a set place in the house. He would always move and walk around the house, and you'd know it was him because you would get this feeling that you weren't alone. He'd be walking beside you or on top of the staircase, just watching. I have to add that he never felt evil. He was definitely not an angry spirit, more like a watcher. I also want to add that I describe him like a man because I remember him being very tall and his silhouette was a masculine shape. Other than that, you couldn't make out his face or anything else. He seemed like he may have been cloaked or hooded sometimes, though. He never did much, just came and left. Everyone, except my younger sister because she was too young, knew about the Shadow Man, but once he appeared to someone who was alone. I should mention that before I was born in 1997, that my great-grandmother on my dad's side had died of old age in the house. She had passed away in the back bedroom, which became me and my brother's room when my younger sister was born. My dad was with her on that night, and says that she saw something. He walked out of the room and came back, and she was dead. Anyways, my parents got married and we moved in 2012, and I haven't seen the Shadow Man since. Whenever I think about it though, or hear similar stuff, all the hair on my body stands up, and my right eye drops a single tear, every time, without fail. It's even happening as I type. I try to control it, but I can't. I've had other supernatural encounters, and this always happens. This is the only time I have ever had a threatening contact or experience. In June of 2019, me and a friend had decided to go with our girlfriends on a camping trip. It's the day of, and we're packing all of our things into the car. We finally get everything loaded and get into the car and put the address in the GPS. We set off, and after 3 hours of driving and 45 minutes of hearing my friend and his girl argue, we finally arrive. We get out of the car, and me and my friend begin to unload. After getting my stuff, I begin to gather my girlfriend's things. As I was, my friend was asking his girlfriend why she needed 3 bags for a one-night camping trip. She smiled and opened one of them, which contained an ounce of pot and other paraphernalia. The other 2 bags had her favorite snacks and clothes. Now knowing that we had weed, we had to find a place to camp that wasn't near any other people. It took until sundown, but we discovered the perfect spot. We decided that after we got everything taken care of, we would eat hot dogs and smoke. We started to build a campfire to light the area so that we could set up our tents, but ran out of wood immediately. I said that I would go get some while my friend stayed with the girls. I set off on my journey, and after about 2 minutes I find some sticks to use. I start picking them up, and all of a sudden, I felt someone grab my wrist. I looked up to see a very pale, strange-looking man wearing a blank expression. For a man, he also had surprisingly long fingernails. He was digging them into my wrist while trying to grab my other wrist. I turned my head to not see his face and screamed for help, and my friends shouted a response, saying that they were coming. After they shouted, I immediately felt relief in my wrist. I wasn't struggling to keep my arms down, so I turned and ran as fast as I could, horrified. I met up with my friends and said that we had to leave immediately. I didn't even bother to explain myself. I just wanted gone. We loaded back up and took the long walk back. We get to the car and load our bags into it. I explained what happened as we were walking back, and it scared them enough to make them want to hustle. I had a picture of my wrist right after, but my iPhone broke and my cloud wasn't backed up, so I lost it. I do have a picture of it now, though. It has since then become a scar, which shows just how much force he was using. It was absolutely terrifying. I have a story from about 2 years ago that really captivates me to this day. When I've told this story to close friends, they tell me it's straight out of a movie. I can't really disagree with that. This starts when I finished my first year of college in the Bay Area. I worked my ass off in school and I just wanted to have a wild summer, and I would do anything I could to get out of the house. My cousin was and is my best friend, and we basically did anything and everything together. When there wasn't anything to do, we'd take walks together around my rural neighborhood. I always lived near this old hospital, which used to operate as the biggest trauma unit in my area. Sometime when I was in high school, they shut the hospital down for some reason that I still don't know. It basically just sat there rotting for a few years before we found it. One day we were drinking a cold one and taking one of our routine walks and ventured away from our usual route through this peaceful, random field. We stumbled across this huge parking lot after making it out of the field, but it didn't hit me that this was the old hospital's parking lot that we had found. We made our way through the lot until we saw this massive building standing on the outside. The deteriorated banner said emergency room. And this was when we knew we had struck gold and stumbled across a back route to this abandoned hospital. We knew of this place, but we had never been here. We hadn't heard any weird, outlandish urban legends, nor had anyone that we knew been here before us. We pushed forward and checked out the perimeter. To our surprise, the first door we walked up to had a rock jammed in between the door frames so that we could just waltz right in. This was when it occurred to us that it could be a potentially bad idea if we got caught, and we could suffer some consequences. We agreed we would be quiet and respectful and make it a quick trip. This is where things take a turn. Or a few turns. We entered the building and it was the most deafening quiet that I had ever experienced. The sound of the door closing was like a literal bomb going off. Once the echo stopped from the door, it dawned on us that this place was straight up creepy. We walked slowly, but the floor is covered in glass, which makes even the smallest of steps sound like Bigfoot lumbering around a library. We found a patient room, which still had a bed inside. We stopped at the doorway to look in because the floor looked sketchy. Out of nowhere, from around the corner, we heard the faintest, slow, drawn-out whistling. I've never in my life stopped what I was doing so suddenly. I just stared wide-eyed at my cousin because even a whisper sounds like yelling in this place. We both have our feet planted to the ground, because if we move, then we too will make ourselves known. At this point, we both assumed there could potentially be a squatter or a guard of some sort. My cousin hand gestures to me that we have to leave and we can't just stand here because the whistling was obviously not going to stop. We turn toward the opposite of the corner that the whistling is at, and we're tiptoeing to a perfect silence. Then the whistling stopped. We freeze again, and we hear the glass crunching from around the corner. We start running. Once we get to the door we came from, we realize we didn't put a fucking rock in the door frame when we came in, and now the door is completely stuck. As we were trying to get this door open, the glass crunching is now running. We hear it until it sounds like it is dangerously close. I am horrified. We turn around to try another door and the noise of the glass is literally right in front of us. Yet no one is there. No one. We book it to a door that says pharmacy and peel the door open. The pharmacy is completely empty except a single, perfectly placed and aligned landline phone plugged into the wall. The phone is off the hook and making a dial tone. The whole thing is so perfectly lined up and centered with the whole room, I've never seen anything like it. And the dial tone was so loud in such an empty place. There wasn't power throughout the hospital, so how was it working? I was in complete shock. We left and never went back. I had heard of some other kids going there at night. They told me that they also heard the whistling and thought someone was lurking in the shadows the whole time. It is a freaky world out there. I grew up in a historical town in the UK where there is a cathedral that's over 700 years old. For hundreds of years, people across England and beyond would pilgrimage to it. My family bought a house in this town and decided to renovate it. From the start, I had edgy feelings about the place, but being a generally nervous teen at the time, I put it down to me just being silly. My dad is a total no bullshit kind of guy. Calls a spade, has no time for the paranormal, spiritual, or religious chat. He thinks in terms of logic and realism and trusts what he can see and touch. My mom and him have had some heated debates about the fact that she has seen or felt unexplained things, and he scoffs at that. Basically, if anything spooky ever happened to him, I would believe it purely because he doesn't. I found this out years later. One night, Dad was woken up by the sound of hooves galloping. We slept on the ground floor, but nowhere near cattle or horses, so the unusual noise woke him up. He got up and left the bedroom to look for the source of the sound. He took one step toward the lounge door in front of him and opened it. The lounge door had windows that opened out onto the main road. Through the window, all he could see were rows and rows of heads walking past the house. The heads had gold helmets with red plumage on them, and they all moved toward the center of town, toward the cathedral. They didn't pay attention to him, but just moved silently through, just their heads facing toward town. We knew the road that we lived on was built on a Roman road, and he believed that these were Roman soldiers on horseback making their way to the city. Over the years, the land would have been built on and up an accumulated height. So in this day and age, all that you could see of them was their neck and head. This happened around 13 years ago when I was a sophomore in college, attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys, myself included, and 1 girl. And they all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy, wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. Perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off of a very busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you're almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees. Very few streetlights and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off of the main road, driving about 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting intentionally lost. Our cars made a turn and, to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see exactly what this was, stepped over the log, and noticed 2 narrow trails leading off in different directions. This seemed like as good a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the sense that we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. In any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. Not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. What would we come across that could take us down? We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing. And I mean massive. It was a large, open field of unkempt grass. Comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. The trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we could not see the end of it from where we were standing. I was so thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark, with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, The windows and doors were all boarded up. I peered between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live there, they were long gone. Because there was no way in, and because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we all decided to walk closer to the trail we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked back towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he pointed. We all turned, and on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. By dancing, I mean that it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same thing to another one. Basically kind of like a do-si-do type motion. The moon was so bright, and the woods were so dark, it actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him, pointed in that direction, and said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see that?" He squinted a bit, and the second that he did see it, he gasped with everything that he had, clutched my arm, and whispered, "What the fuck is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever it was, they stopped dancing, looked in our direction, and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was happening. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running like hell, I heard Jay scream, "Holy shit!" I looked back and saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and were peeling away in closer to 5. Once we were at a safe distance, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I knew everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we are all still friends, living in different states yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, children, etc. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others, something to the effect of, "The woods. That really happened, right?" It most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did that thing know we were there from the second we parked? Was it the sound that I kept hearing when we walked the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around to see what he was truly capable of. "10 years ago, I was a stupid 18-year-old kid who was living with his parents in Flagstaff, Arizona. We moved almost every 3 years due to the nature of my dad's work, so I got to see most of the country. It was a Tuesday in November. My mom said that we were packing up the apartment and moving to Seattle for what was going to be another year and 2 months. I had a small 300cc motorcycle at the time. I think it was a V-Star, but I could be wrong. And decided to hook up a GPS and use the time to go on a ride across the West Coast. My mother didn't like the idea, but I knew that I would be safe due to personal experience and knowing when and when not to ride. Besides, it would be a 3-day trip and I would get to see all sorts of neat stuff along the way. I notified my job that I was going to transfer, threw on my saddlebags, and a day later was on the road. I made it all the way through western Nevada in order to avoid LA traffic, and stopped prior to taking the I-5 into California. That evening I stayed in a Days Inn hotel. After breakfast and a talk with the locals, I crossed through Reno into western Cali. From there, it was only 4 more hours until I reached Oregon. Luckily, I had time to spare, so I wanted to take some back roads and discover what this dank, damp state had to offer. It was fall, and there was a deep chill in the air. Riding through it sent shivers down my spine like nothing else. November's weather in Oregon is almost identical to that of Pittsburgh during that season. It makes you want to curl up into a ball and sleep for a decade, only to wake up and repeat the process all over again. Eventually, I got tired enough that I wanted to find somewhere to stay, and managed to see a sign advertising a Green Hills hunting lodge on the side of the road. It was accompanied by a long, steep hill that took me what felt like an hour to climb. Then, when I reached the top, I was greeted by a large and gorgeous cabin that looked like it was specifically made for weddings, like something ripped out of a fairy tale. Bewildered, I parked my bike, took off my bags, and threw a tarp over it, which was secured to bungee cords. I walked inside and met a Korean woman who was working the front desk. She spoke perfect English, but had a very distinct accent in which she explained to me that I could choose my room due to an abundance of vacancy. Cool, right? I chose room 31, as the entire building was all on one floor that evening. She handed me a key with the tag 31 attached via a keyring and tells me to have a good night. I throw all my stuff down and head to the bathroom to wash up after riding for an entire day. The room itself looks like a cabin and is absolutely gorgeous. The floorboards were all real wood, and even the shower had the same natural wood as the tub surrounding it. I take a shower and then head to bed, and realize that the mattress is incredibly comfortable and make myself cozy, only to realize that something is off. It's not something obvious, but I knew that there was some sort of oddity about this place. I push it to the back of my mind and fall asleep. The next morning, I wake up to find that the walls went from a natural brown to a deeper gray, as if they were stained overnight. This wasn't a result of natural lighting versus LED. The room was without a doubt a different color. I shrug it off and get all my stuff together, making sure that everything is still where I left it. I head out of the room to find that not only had the walls changed color, I was on a second floor that previously didn't exist. The light from the morning sun wasn't permeating the windows of the cabin, and there was no one in sight. I started to freak out, nearly having a panic attack because this wasn't right. Thankfully, there were stairs that I dashed down as fast as I could and made my way to the front desk and rang the bell once, twice, 3 times. I was breathing heavy and knew that I had to get out of there. No one was coming to check up on me after about 10 minutes of waiting, so I dashed out of the doors and into the lot. I ripped the tarp off of my bike and looked back at the lodge. It wasn't the same. This was a broken down, abandoned, dirty building that looked as though it was about to be condemned. I didn't want to ask any more questions, and rode off as fast as I could. That place still haunts me, even to this day. I'm living in an older century 3-story house in a small town in Ontario. I was laying on the first set of stairs beside the front door next to my dog, I think taking his leash off for a walk. He's a big boxer shepherd full of love. Anyways, I hear this very loud and unusual sound, like something has come loose or broken. I'm home alone. I actually thought maybe it had come from the basement because I was so close by there. But then I realized that it was not, because the sound had gotten further away. I went up to the 3rd floor, which is actually like a split level with 2 empty rooms. Both remain empty since we've lived here, my wife and I. I go upstairs, not sure what I was expecting, but generally am a very logical human being. We have old bedroom doors with skeleton key handles, and when I get upstairs, I see that one handle is literally shaking up and down, almost vibrating. It didn't just go on for a couple of seconds. Remember, it carried on from when I went to check the basement and went upstairs, and now, as I was staring at it, it continued to vibrate. I grabbed the handle to make it stop, which it did completely. I opened the door to see nothing there and nothing in the room across either. We keep both doors closed, and the windows closed, and also the vents closed because we don't want heat or cool coming up to a floor that we don't even use. To this day, I have not figured out what caused this, and it hasn't happened since. Note, I don't remember any behavior from my dog. He may have been a bit timid, but he gets like this whenever my mood shifts to anxiety. There's one other experience that I had in our home. Our dining room is attached to the garage, and it is not a proper exterior door. It's another old, beautiful wooden door with a skeleton key and all. One day as I was cleaning, I shut the door just enough so that it was closed but not fully sealed, which I do this all the time. I went to my bedroom and heard the door to the garage swing open. Again, no other surrounding windows were open that could have made the air shift. Nothing was different than any other day when I do this. One other side note, my dog is terrified of our rocking chair. It's an old one that I had spray painted black. Never thought anything of it because honestly this dog is kind of scared of everything. He doesn't like certain flooring, which I'm assuming is because he must have had a bad fall at our old house or something, because even if I put a big piece of meat treat for him across a tiled floor, he won't enter. And yes, we trim his claws, so I'm thinking it's a bit of trauma or a phobia. He's a big baby, so it's probably nothing but just another weird thing to the house. Any ideas on the shaking handle, though? It was aggressive, and even if something was in an empty room, something, say, fell on it, causing it to shake, why wouldn't it stop? A couple of years ago, me and my pops decided to go on a road trip. It was very out of the blue. I wasn't even expecting it, but I decided to go anyways. It would be some solid father-son bonding time. After driving for what seemed like a couple of hours, was around maybe 8 to 9 p.m., we pulled into this gas station for snacks, water, and to use the bathroom, and we went back inside of our car. Keep in mind, this gas station was basically in the middle of nowhere. Anyways, we got back into our car and decided to look for a motel, but there was none. And I mean not a single one anywhere near us. My dad was really tired, so we just decided to go to sleep in the vehicle. We pulled up into this sort of resting area / parking lot and decided to pass out for the night. My dad fell fast asleep, but I was on my phone for a couple more hours, and around 11 p.m. I just felt suffocated by the tense air and decided to step out for a bit. I felt safe because the gas station was still in sight, and there would be a couple of trucks that would occasionally drive by, so I was at ease. At the time, I was also texting my friend who lives in Seattle, Washington. We were on the phone for a little while. Then I saw what looked like a large cornfield, and I had never actually seen a cornfield in real life, so I decided to cross the road and just get a closer look. That's exactly what I did. I got extremely close, and I started feeling like I was being watched, but again I just thought, well, you're literally outside in the dark, standing next to a tall cornfield, of course you're going to feel this way. So I just brushed it off. I even considered going in, but I thought, why would I even do that? So anyways, I just decided to take a step back when I noticed a barn. It was a large, white barn with red, maybe black stripes. It was hard to tell in the dark, but it was definitely a barn. I was stupid and young when this happened, maybe 14 or 15. Out of curiosity, I decided to go check it out, and the barn was next to the cornfield, sort of tucked in a little. I literally thought, haha, I wish I could see something that would freak me out, as a joke, because I never really thought that anything would happen, and I love being scared. Anyways, I started making my way toward the barn. As I was getting closer and closer, I remembered very vividly that I was wearing no socks, just slip-on slides. I remember the dirt rubbing against my toes as I stepped. I remember sending pictures to my friend in Washington. I jokingly was saying that I saw something and that I was going to check it out. As I got closer, I saw something. It was behind the barn, but sort of off to the side, like how when someone peers around a corner. I thought it was a bell. Literally, I assumed that it was a bell attached to the corner of the barn, so I just walked a little closer. Even as I'm writing this, I am getting goosebumps. I walked closer and saw the head of someone or something just peering around the corner at me. At that moment, I just straight up froze. My fight or flight was out of function because there I was literally seeing someone or something peering at me. After about 5 to 10 seconds, the noise that Snapchat makes when you get a notification snapped me out of it, and I just ran as fast as I could across the road to my dad's car and got in. I felt a sense of relief wash over my body. Somehow my dad was not awake. Me gasping for air wasn't enough to wake him from his deep sleep. I really considered waking him up and telling him what I saw and that we had to leave, but he would just assume that I was joking or having an episode. Which sounds dumb, but he's assumed that before, since he never has believed in anything paranormal or anything out of the ordinary related. I took deep breaths and just texted my friend telling her what I saw, and even she didn't believe me. I don't blame her. And I wouldn't blame any of you either. Sometimes I have a hard time actually believing what I saw. But I know that it was real. I was sober and fully aware. But from the bottom of my heart, the part that disturbs me the most is that whatever was peering at me from around that corner was very tall. At least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and every time I think about this, I get a sense of dread and paranoia. I haven't told any of my family or my dad, but if any of you have a clue as to what I might have seen, please let me know. Again, I wasn't hallucinating. This was before I even figured out anything about psychedelics or drugs in general. Please let me know if you have any ideas or info. Also, it probably sounds fake because if someone came to me telling me what I'm saying, I would also just rule it out to be fake. But please, I've been trying to piece it together for the last couple of months. I was sort of 50-50 on paranormal encounters, but after that experience, I believe. I believe in walkers to wendigos. I believe in ghosts to La Llorona. It has changed me, knowing what's out there. And everyone wants to believe, oh yeah, ghosts aren't real. But I feel like they are deep down. We know that there is some messed up stuff out there in this world. And I happened to encounter something. When I was 14, I went camping in the summer with the Girl Guides. We only traveled a few miles away to a place that we had visited a few times for game nights. Each year, our guides would merge with the 2 others in the area for a huge campout that lasted about 5 days. The place we were staying in was rumored to have a ghost in the main house. The story says that it only shows itself to members of the family. We were staying on the large estate near the woods, right away from the house. I had been there quite a lot, and knew the grounds pretty well, which was awesome. I was staying in a tent with the younger girls. They were aged 10 to 13, because I didn't have my own tent like the other older girls. The first night went by smoothly. We built a climbing frame, lit candles in the dark, and pretended that we had landed on an alien planet. It was a silly, fun game. The next morning, me and one of the other girls get up early. Our group job was to collect firewood for breakfast, so we ventured into the woods on our own. We were joking around, grabbing sticks and stuff as we walked along. We ended up at the obstacle course and decided to play on it for a while, even though it was out of bounds. When we were done, we grabbed the firewood and started walking back to camp. The woods, to me, they felt and looked strange. It was as if the place was slightly different. I decided to start trying to scare the girl that I was with, just messing around, trying to spook her because it was funny to me. She got really scared and ran off and left me behind. I wasn't bothered as I slowly walked back. That was when I saw movement to my left, and then again up ahead. As I was about to leave the woods, I saw a man out of the corner of my eye. He was wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, carrying something long. I think it was a shotgun. There was no one there. I just shrug it off. Stuff like that doesn't bother me. I've seen strangers out in the woods before. Once out of the forest, everything goes back to normal. I looked back and the woods were as they should have been. Not like they were moments ago. I don't know how to explain it. They just seemed newer for a while. Not as wild, I guess. But everything was kind of grainy, misty. Except that there was no mist. So I don't think anything of it. I enjoy the camp out, we play games, sing songs, and just have a good time. On the second to last day, we play the game. We landed on the alien planet, and once we had breakfast, we had to go hide in the woods, build a shelter, a fire to make food, and people had to go steal food from the campsite without being seen. I am left in the woods on my own for ages as the other girls go around gathering the food. I built a pretty awesome shelter, but I realized I needed my penknife, which I had left in my tent, so I went to go get it. I get to the tent to find the kids that I was sharing it with, crying their eyes out, terrified. Eventually, I get the story out of them. They had been making their food when a man, wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, had appeared and then vanished in front of them where I had seen him. I assured the kids that it was fine, and that it couldn't hurt them, and they eventually went back into the woods, but they were obviously very shaken. I got the blame for telling them a scary story, but I had only tried to scare that one girl at the very start and hadn't mentioned anything about the man to anyone. That night was the campfire. As it ended, we all ran through the pitch-black woods back to camp, leaving the person looking after us all alone in the forest. She had a light, so it was no big deal. She had to make sure that the fire was out as well. I found out a week after that she had been horrified walking back to camp and refused to go back into the woods again after that. She has refused to camp at that site ever since, but she won't tell us what she saw. The last day, I got bored while packing everything up. After all that had happened, I was in a ghost hunting mood, so me and two of the other girls go into the trees. I'm in the lead, and I'm walking along a path. I stopped and heard footsteps in front of us. Clear footsteps, walking on dead leaves, but no one was there. No one was anywhere near us. I followed the sounds along a path. Someone had heavy boots on. It was so bizarre. We all had trainers on. The girls I was with were silent. They could hear it as well. I followed the sounds around to a clearing at the very edge of the woods, where it stopped. I decided to sit down in the grass. The others followed me, but they sat behind me because they were scared at this point. I do the whole, "If anyone is there, could you give me a sign?" routine. As I finished, a white mist suddenly fell over the woods. You could see things moving behind it, though nothing was clear. It hung in the air as the other two girls ran off screaming. I sat for a minute and watched before saying thank you. As I said this, it was as if a gust of wind hit, and it disappeared. There was no wind. It was just amazing. That was the last of the strange stuff for that camping trip. We had to finish packing up and left the camp that afternoon. I've been back a few times since, and nothing else strange has happened. The woods have always felt normal. A few years after that, I found out that I'm actually related to the family who owned the house and estate. I'm always curious if the activity picked up because I was staying on the grounds. On Labor Day of 2015, my mother, my wife, 3 children, and I went to a very remote cabin that we had rented out. It was an old fire watchman station or something of the sort, so it had the cabin and 3 other sheds and shops. I'll try to keep it short now, but this is a really bizarre story. We unpacked, settled into the cabin, and decided to take a walk a couple of 100 yards down to the river. We were all barefoot wearing sandals with shorts. We got down to the pebbled shore and were playing, throwing rocks, etc., when I realized that there were 1-foot snakes everywhere. My wife, Mom, and I yanked up the 3 kids and boogied off. After reaching a safe distance, I went back with a water bottle and caught one of them to see what it was. It turns out we were in a nest of diamondback rattlesnakes. If one of those things had latched onto one of my kids, then surely they would have died. We were about 3 hours away from any medical facility. We got back to the cabin and my mom and I went for a hike alone while my wife calmed the kiddos and fed them lunch. Upon returning about 15 minutes later, all 3 of my wife and kids were inside with the doors and windows all closed, even though we had opened everything up to cool the place off. We went inside to hear all 4 of them start yelling about a bear that was about 150 yards from the cabin, huffing and puffing at the wife and kids on the front porch while they were eating. It was down by the river, another 30 yards or so down the hill. A few hours go by, and in that time, an ATV passed 3 times with 2 inbred-looking freaks on it, and each time they stopped in front of the gate onto the property and stared at us or the cabin. Keep in mind, again, we're hours into the wilderness in Idaho with no sight of a person the entire trip except for them. We decide it's bedtime for the kiddos, as it's pitch black out. Within 10 minutes, our son, who was 5 at the time, went from being perfectly fine, active, and talkative to having a fever of 103 degrees, slightly foaming at the mouth, and being completely unresponsive. That was it. We were leaving immediately and going to seek medical attention. I opened the front door of the cabin to start loading the 2 cars, and that's when we heard 3 adults and what sounded like 4 or 6 large, heavy animals running all around the cabin and property. There was one on the right side of the house, when exiting, that I could hear pacing back and forth, breathing heavily. I made everyone stay inside and close the door every time I went out to transfer stuff into the vehicles, which took me about 4 to 5 trips. I had a stick in a big pot that I was smacking as hard and loud as I could each time and was yelling loudly at random. As soon as I finished the loading, I took out each kid individually and loaded them into the cars. Then I escorted out my mom and then my wife. My wife and I were in the lead car, so we pulled up out of the gate, and for some stupid reason or other, I felt that I needed to close it. I got out of my vehicle and walked behind it, and my mom's car by about 15 feet, and closed the gate. Now, this gate is literally a log that slides from one post to the other. It offered 0 protection or barrier between me and the animals that sounded like they were out there. Right as I went to turn around, I heard loud padded footsteps walking up to me. Directly in front of me, no more than 10 feet, I see eyes shimmering from the moonlight as the deepest, scariest growl I have ever heard in my life rumbles through the air. I turned and ran so fast I swear that I must have jumped from where I was to the driver's seat of my car some 30 feet in front of me. As I landed in my seat, I slammed it into drive and spun out, finally leaving. It gets weirder and scarier, though. About 15 minutes down the road, we were still panicking about our unresponsive son. We both kept having this horrible, evil doom kind of feeling, like a shadow over us. I looked down and realized that I still had that baby rattlesnake in the water bottle in my cup holder, so I grabbed it and threw it out the window immediately. Not even 2 minutes later, we softly hear our son begin to cry. We realize that he's become responsive, and he stated something along the lines of, "Why are we leaving? What's going on?" He was crying because he was sad to leave. He couldn't even remember the last hour. The next day, my mom broke down extremely badly, sobbing her eyes out, and was hardly able to even speak. She confessed to my wife that the night before we left, she had a nightmare in which we went on the camping trip. We came across snakes, a bear, and a pack of wolves. She said that she knew a lot of bad things happened at that outpost, and that it was full of evil. Most of all, she said that one of our kids died. I swear on my life to this very day, if I ask her who died and how it happened, she immediately starts crying and refuses to tell me, or anyone else, anything more. She lives her life now with a guilt that she willingly ignored her premonition and put us in that situation, nearly taking the life of one of her dearest grandkids away. She doesn't deserve to feel like that. I know this all sounds insane, but a week later on the local news were reports of a wolf pack in that area. Wolves and bears may not coexist in harmony, but they do share territories and tend to respect each other. This outpost station of sorts was 1.5 hours into the wilderness from Loman Banks, Idaho, if you want to verify that these animals actually exist around there. I grew up in the mountains for most of my pre-early teen years, as did my wife until she was 10 years old. I even have a half a sleeve of the wilderness and trees on my left arm. With that said, we don't care to go to the mountains anymore. For a little backstory, my partner and I have been dating for about 1.5 years. This February, I was given tickets as a birthday gift to finally visit him, as I'm in Scotland. Experience 1. I spent the middle of February over in Arizona visiting my partner. While we're both interested in the paranormal, I believe in it all, having had multiple experiences, whereas he tends to just humor me, not believing in it much himself. He's never mentioned anything odd happening in his apartment, but I saw, heard, and felt small things the first couple of days that I was there. One morning in particular at around 4 a.m. I was on the sofa playing on my phone, jet lag, when I looked up and saw a figure standing over him as he slept. It was similar to a shadow person phenomenon, just a dark humanoid shape, but it felt nasty. When I saw it, it turned, almost as if it was startled to see someone else in the room. Never mind, someone who could also see it. It did sort of a double take and then disappeared, but the energy in the room felt off. I performed a cleansing ritual that I've come to rely on when negative energies are bothering me. For the remainder of my trip, the apartment felt light and airy, with the exception of later that day when I was taking a nap and felt what I thought was my partner standing over me watching me sleep. I opened my eyes and felt the negative presence over me, as though trying to work out who I was and why I was there. It was then told in very clear terms that it wasn't welcome, whether I was there or not, and it cleared out. No more issues, so that was fine. Experience 2. My partner's friends, another couple, really helped in making me feel welcome, and the 4 of us went out on road trips a couple of times, once to Jerome and another to a recreational spot by a lake. I felt a little funny anytime we were driving around near or on the reservations, as though the native spirits were very much aware of us going through their land, but nothing felt bad, just sort of a curiosity. But one instance in particular sticks out. While driving toward Phoenix after a day at the lake, we were all chatting away in the car when we got into reservation territory. I got that not alone feeling again, but still, it was curious, though this time it was more intense. There was a lull in the conversation, and I was just admiring the landscape as the sun was going down, when in the middle of the center embankment on the road, there was a figure that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. I know it was male, and I know that he was a Native American. Nothing felt wrong, but when I asked if anyone else had seen him, they all said no, despite the fact that, as far as I was concerned, you couldn't miss him. He was old, tall, and completely white. His clothes, hair, everything, with an aura of hazy light around him, simply standing and watching over the road. I don't know who he was, but it felt like he was watching over the people traveling through his land. It was comforting. So much can happen in the forest. There are wild animals, possibly bad people, and the unknown itself. While hiking in Switzerland, I decided to see Matterhorn, the famous mountain, up close. As close as I could. So I left the village I was staying in early and walked through meadows, hills, and then up the mountains to reach the plateau. Early in the morning, after just leaving the town, I walked the straight path. Past some houses on the left, town behind, mountain ahead, and forest on the right. In front of the forest, there were a few curious old huts on long legs, ones that you climb up to by ladder. They were all made of round planks and black soot. My imagination immediately called them witch huts, relating them to movies and legends that I knew. They seemed closed, and I couldn't get into any of them, but I felt a slight shiver of excitement and didn't really want to get in. So I kept on walking. I saw the mountain, met some people, had lunch, and in the afternoon decided to walk back to town. I remembered the way and backtracked pretty much exactly. On my way back, the mountain was behind me, the town ahead, houses and meadows on the right, and black spooky huts on the left, guiding the entrance, a path leading into the forest. I should note that despite checking out the huts in the morning, I didn't notice that there was a forest path starting behind them. Curious about it, I checked the wooden road signs placed in the vicinity of the huts. To my surprise, the one pointing into the woods said Zermatt, but the one pointing to where I originally came from in the morning said some other town's name. I was very confused. I looked back and looked again, thinking that maybe my brain was tricking me, but I kept seeing what I saw. I stood there while a few hikers passed in each direction. All stayed on the mountain path, nobody went into the forest or looked at the road signs. I sat there in front of the huts and smoked a cigarette. I debated whether or not I should go into the forest, why the signs showed such weird directions. I wondered if there was a reason I should go in. But I was already very tired to the point of my legs feeling weak. So I decided to go back the way I came, to trust my gut and take the most common main path back to town. When I stood up, the signs were different again. There was no way anyone could have rearranged them. No wind or human. I was there the whole time, and the only people who walked by didn't stop at the signs, let alone tinker with them. The one pointing into the forest said some other name, and the one pointing to my starting point said Zermatt like it should. I told this story to my friend in Zermatt, and he just laughed at the idea of paranormal entities trying to lure me into the forest. I did have a creepy feeling about the huts, but at the same time it was a beautiful day, and I still wonder whether there was some kind of adventure waiting for me if I took the forest path. What do you think? Back in the mid-'80s, we were traveling through Tennessee on the way to visit friends in Texas. Mom was driving, and I, a teenager at the time, was navigating by using a paper map, as these were the days before cell phones and GPS. We made it past Nashville on I-40 pretty late at night. We were maybe an hour outside the city. I was charting our progress old school with pencil and paper. We pass an exit, I mark it. A minute later, a summer thunderstorm hit. Visibility dropped to nothing, all traffic slows to a crawl, and we decide to pull off at the next possible exit and find a motel to spend the night, because there's no way that we're making significant progress in this storm. Slow, white-knuckle driving ensues. An exit looms up on the right, no signage that we can see in the downpour, and we take it. At the top of the exit ramp, we turn right toward a brilliantly lit-up gas station. It was a left turn onto an overpass crossing I-40 with no lights from that side of the interstate. We were on a dinky little road at that point. To our right, there was a gas station which we're rapidly passing. To our left and back behind some trees was what appeared to be a motel, but you couldn't make out the sign well in the rain. We drove past the gas station before we really realized that the road just ended ahead. The gas station was the only building on this side of the road. It went from a 1.5 lane that was paved to a 1-lane gravel road, we could see a short way ahead, to tire track dirt and grass, all over the space of maybe 20 yards. Now, we were past this gas station, and there was only one turnoff from this road. It was on our left. We took it and tried to back up and turn around to get back to the gas station. Unfortunately, the paved slope of that narrow, driveway-sized turnoff led steeply down into a huge mud pit. No backing up out of it. My mom put the car into low gear, turned hard, and headed back for the gravel road through the mud. We almost made it, but got mired out. The front passenger tire caught on the corner of an exposed concrete storm drain, maybe 3 feet from the road. Out of the car, into the rain and mud. We walked to the gas station. The place was spotless, super bright, and had 2 young men behind the counter. What sounded like one of Elvis's songs was playing on their radio inside. Attendants' first words on seeing us walk in were, "Did you get stuck in the mud?" They said it as a super enthusiastic, way too happy greeting. Like Disney staffer welcoming you as you walk into the park for the first time levels of happy. Also, these night shift clerks were dressed in suits that looked about 30 years out of date. The place was kinda creepy. We admitted that we had, indeed, gotten stuck. We asked if there was a towing company that we could call. They pulled out a phone book. Again, this was before cell phones or the internet, and started talking to each other. It was not a Nashville phone book, some little township. Population couldn't have been more than 100 from the handful of white pages, but the book had dozens of yellow pages of nothing but tow truck companies. Like literally hundreds of tow truck companies for this town too small to appear on the map. The attendants had a friendly debate about whose turn it was to get a car out of the mud. They decided to skip over the company who was theoretically next because there had been some sort of problem with them the last time that they were called out for a tow. They made a decision on who to call and let my mom use their phone. More weirdness, and the creepiness intensifies. It was still storming, though less at that point. The truck arrives maybe 5 minutes later. Brilliant white. Not a speck of dirt or a drop of mud on it. I've seen vehicles in a new car lot that were dirtier. The 2 young men in the truck are also dressed like they had just stepped out of the 1950s. They were wearing freshly polished patent leather shoes without a drop of mud on them, along with starched white shirts, paper hats, and bow ties. We hike across the street next door to the mud pit where our car is stuck. The tow truck guys are horrified. "They almost got out of the mud?" they say to each other repeatedly. The subtext from their shocked tone is clear. No one must ever, ever escape the mud pit on their own. These people will have to take some sort of action to make sure that no one else gets as close as we did to escaping. They tow the car out. Easy peasy. We all go back to the gas station. We pay the tow truck drivers for services. The drivers let the gas station attendants know that my mom and I almost made it out of the mud on our own. The attendants, again, are horrified and shocked by this. By now we're getting huge, uncanny valley vibes from all 4 of these men, and not just them, the whole place is too clean, too brightly lit, and too weirdly out of date. It was a surprisingly good facsimile of a small town rest stop populated by real humans. Almost perfect, in fact. We are definitely in Creepy Town. If these guys were humans, there was seriously something off about them. If they weren't, they almost had their ordinary human act down pat. The truck drivers leave. The attendants turn, all super friendly again, and ask Mom and me if we're going to stay the night in the hotel across the road. They're so excited that we might spend the night here. They talk about how great it is. Mom and I make non-committal noises and return to the car. I tell Mom, we're not staying here tonight. She agrees wholeheartedly. The rain is finally letting up. We drive down I-40 to the very next exit. It was maybe 5 miles. We pull off and spend the night in a kind of crappy but ordinary motel. At least it's not the Bates Motel, we joke. The rest of the trip goes well. Then, several days later on the way home, Mom and I decide that we would really like to see the creepy town in the light of day. It couldn't have been that weird, could it? Heading back up I-40, we passed the exit where we actually did spend the night on the way down. We can see the hotel, the exit number matches the notes that I had made on the map, everything. Then we start looking for the next exit. The exit to Creepy Town. Should be about 5 miles along with an overpass. 5 miles pass. No exit. No overpass. 5 more miles later before we find the next exit off of I-40. It's the one that I had marked as being right before the storm first hit. In short, Creepy Town does not exist. I have traveled I-40 many times since, often remarking that, hey, there's that exit where the weird storm hit and we went to Creepy Town, and there's the exit that we actually did spend the night at. We never found the Creepy Town exit between those 2 points, ever again. This is my one and only paranormal or unexplained experience. I was never exactly a believer, but I'd never completely disregarded the existence of the otherworldly. It happened a few years ago, sometime in the winter of 2016. I randomly woke up in the middle of the night, and the first thing that I noticed was how dark that my room was. It was supposed to be dark, as I had all my lights off and the windows closed, but you know, a little bit of tiny light from the outside street light always finds a way to enter from the edges of closed windows, like you can barely distinguish the pitch black from a slight aura, right? But there was none of it. It was pitch black all around. I thought it was probably a power outage, and I started to think random stuff like, probably this is what blind people see all their life. Must be sad. And slowly drifting back into sleep, when I was suddenly reawoken by the feeling of my bed shaking. I thought I had fallen asleep, and this is one of those sleep jerks that happen when you fall into your dream. But then more stuff started to happen. Soon after the first shake, there was a second one, which I felt much more clearly. A big rat had been invading our kitchen for a while, and I thought maybe it had somehow snuck into my room. But how could a rat shake my bed? Then, a few seconds later, I felt a literal punch under my bed, as if someone had punched the underside of my mattress right beneath where I was laying. I felt the mattress bump up in the center of my back. Oddly enough, instead of freaking out, I became extremely calm. And oddly enough again, I started to think of a logical reason. My mom made me check under my bed before sleeping, as she thought that some thief might have snuck into our home. She overthinks a lot. I thought that maybe someone actually had snuck in this time, but why would he disturb me instead of... And I felt another 2 consecutive punches from under me, right as I was having that thought. I froze for a solid minute, finally realizing that things might be abnormal here. Maybe I'm bragging, but after freezing initially, I went weirdly calm again, almost as if my brain went, oh no, it's a ghost. Anyway... There was a final punch, followed again by the bed shaking. I remember as the bed was shaking, I got up almost subconsciously, walked straight to the light switch on the other side of the room, and turned the lights on. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I looked under my bed with a flashlight. Also nothing. I should have freaked out here, but I didn't, which is really odd for someone like me who gets nervous and shaky for even the simplest social situations. My body worked almost on its own. I turned the lights off, took the flashlight with me to bed, and fell asleep as soon as I hit the mattress. And then it was morning. Nothing ever happened after that. This is a completely true story. There was one time about 2 or 3 years ago. I was out in the woods camping with my brother, and we had just gotten there around 4 p.m. to set up and all. Once we had settled in, we got a fire going. I told my brother I was going to go get some firewood because we only had enough to get it started. So I went out, and it was around 7 p.m. Then I got really cold all of a sudden, even though the weather was not cold at all. When I got the sudden rush of coldness, I felt a heavy feeling of just pure evil, hatred, and despair. I immediately went back to my brother. He told me it was fine, that it was probably just a strong wind that had given me a chill. But I knew that something was wrong. We sat around the fire, and I just felt like someone or something was watching me. Once again, I started to feel the same feeling of evil, but this time faintly. It slowly started getting worse and worse, almost as if it were growing inside of me. I brushed it off and went back to bed. At around 2:20-ish in the morning, I heard something that sounded like a scream, and it woke me up. I looked around in the tent and got a flashlight. When I turned the light on, I noticed that my arm was bleeding and had been cut open by something in multiple spots. I woke my brother in a panic and told him what had happened. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, and my arm wasn't even cut, even though I was looking right at it and it was obviously slashed open and bleeding. I said, "Are you joking?" And he continued to say that nothing had happened to me and that I was just pranking him. At that moment, I felt a huge amount of pain in my arm, and then I heard the scream again, but it didn't sound like how a human would scream. It was more of a screech, as if there were an animal or some creature in the distance that was in pain. I looked at my brother and asked if he had heard it, and he asked me, "What do you mean, did I hear that? There was nothing." At that point, I was afraid for my life. I was praying that nothing else would happen, but after a few minutes, I heard the scream again. Every time I heard it, I would feel that dread, that evil again, and my arm would start to have a burning sensation. Eventually, all of it stopped, although after that, I wasn't able to sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my brother that I wanted to leave ASAP. When we went to get into the truck, I could have sworn out of the corner of my eye that I saw something run through the woods. I looked to the right while packing the stuff up, and 4 of the trees had marks like they had been clawed by something. But the thing is that the marks were at least 12 feet up in the trees, maybe higher. I was so tired and scared that I couldn't even think about it anymore. I just got into the truck, and we left. To this day, I still haven't gone camping again. When I was around 12 years old, my family and I moved into a semi-detached house just up the street from our previous home. The house wasn't very big, and the floor plans for our part of the house were completely different from our neighbors. Our neighbors were a lovely little family of 4. Husband is from England, wife from Norway, which is where I live. They also had a 3-year-old little girl and a 6-month-old baby boy. Now, I love children, always have, and at that time, I really wanted to start babysitting. It's quite common to start babysitting at age 12, and I was turning 13 a month later anyway, so I wanted to find some small job. As we got to know our neighbors over the next few months of living there, my parents told the neighbors that if they ever needed a sitter, then it would be nice if they would consider trying me out. Seeing as it would be my first job as a babysitter, we thought it would be smart to start with my next-door neighbors, seeing as my parents would literally be on the other side of the wall just in case anything happened. Cut to a Friday night when my neighbors went to a party that was happening just down the street. I got there at around 8 p.m., and the parents told me that they would come home at around 2 to 3 a.m. Both kids were already sleeping, so they told me to just put on a movie and relax. These kids were the easiest to babysit ever. Once you put them to bed and they fell asleep, absolutely nothing would wake them up. They are some of the heaviest sleepers I've ever seen, so babysitting them was usually pretty uneventful. I was on the couch watching Avatar in the living room on the 2nd floor. The kids had their own separate bedrooms that were just downstairs where the front door was. I could basically see their bedrooms from where I was sitting, as the place was quite small. Because of the hallway, I couldn't see the front door. Again, this house was very small, so as long as the TV wasn't on too loud, then I could hear everything that happened downstairs. At around midnight, I heard the front door unlock, and my neighbors walked in while talking. I heard them close the door, and I heard them start taking off their jackets and their shoes. I thought it was a bit weird that they hadn't called to let me know that they were coming home early, but I just assumed that it must have slipped their minds, so I went downstairs to greet them. I could hear them talking up until the point that I came around the corner to the hallway that led to the door. There was no one there. The talking fell silent the second that I turned the corner. The only sound was from the TV upstairs. My heart started beating so fast and my head was rushing. I ran to the bedrooms and checked the kids before I searched the rest of the house. I opened every door, checked every cabinet for anything that would explain what had just happened, but there was nothing there. The kids were still sound asleep. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was just imagining things. I checked the kids one last time and made certain that the doors were wide open so that I could see them from upstairs. I sat down to finish the movie whilst trying to process what had just taken place. But when I sat down, I noticed that the TV had been shut off, even though I had left it on. When I turned it back on, there was just snow on the screen. I couldn't for the life of me get it to work again. That's when the talking downstairs started up all over. Not only that, but the baby started screaming bloody murder. This baby never woke up from naps, and definitely wouldn't ever scream the way that it did that night. I have never in my life run down a staircase as fast as I did then. I rushed toward the baby's bedroom, only to find the door closed. I ripped it open, picked the baby up, and rushed to pick up his sister. I took them both upstairs and held those kids for almost 3 hours before the parents came back home. The talking and sounds downstairs came and went, as I had the kids with me on the couch. I held them as close to me as I could, and tried my best to help them stay asleep. As the parents came home, I was too scared to walk downstairs to greet them. I couldn't be sure if it was even actually them or not, until they walked up the stairs where they found me clutching their children. Obviously, they noticed that I was upset and asked me what had happened. I honestly felt like I had lost my mind at that point, but I told them the story anyway. After I was finished, they told me that it wasn't the first time anything like that had happened there. Apparently, they heard voices all the time at night. I was kind of mortified that they didn't think to warn me before, but they said that they were sorry that this had happened to me, and the mom walked me home to my house. I slept with the lights on for almost a month after that. Believe it or not, I did go back and babysit those kids again. I'm an OTR truck driver, which means that I drive across the country multiple times in a month-long period. I'd like to share a story with you. On a dark July night around 2 a.m., I was headed south on US 93 highway in Nevada. I was approximately 30 miles north off of Las Vegas. Traffic was scarce. I had not seen a single vehicle for at least 40 minutes. The only source of light that illuminated the road were the truck headlights. I was on the phone with a friend of mine just chatting about random stuff when in the distance about 300 feet ahead of me I saw something on the shoulder of the road. At first I thought it might have been a turned over construction sign or a bag of some sort. But as I was approaching the object, I started to make out some features. It was a human-like figure, I thought. Just to be clear, that area is deserted and there's absolutely nothing to be found within a 25-mile radius. When I was about 5 yards away, I could see it clearly. It was a boy. He was around 8 to 10 years old, I'd say. He had a school backpack and a white plush bunny in his right arm held tightly against his chest. He was just standing there with his cold stare, completely unemotional, looking me directly in the eyes. He didn't break the stare as I passed him. He didn't even blink or flinch, and let me remind you that it's an 80,000-pound semi-truck moving at 65 miles an hour. My heart was racing. My whole body was covered in goosebumps. A cold chill went down my spine. I don't think that I have ever been so disturbed in my life since I've never had any paranormal encounters. Once I passed him, the first thing that came to my mind was that if I see him appear again a couple of miles ahead, I'm gonna have a heart attack. But thankfully, it never happened. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I still don't know what it was. I'm not trying to claim that it was a ghost or the spirit of a deceased child. I just can't find any adequate explanation to it. It was definitely not a hallucination since I was wide awake and talking on the phone. It just seems weird to me. What in the world was a 10-year-old kid doing by himself in the middle of a desert? I lost my dad a couple of years ago to ALS. It was a rough way to go. We were very close. I'm an only child and a daddy's girl. We always promised each other whoever went first that we would try to reach out from the other side. There have been many ways that he's been in touch. Some have been more subtle, like giving me the strong urge to hear a song that's not my usual genre, country, but while I was deeply grieving, I suddenly had to hear Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. I always thought that was just a breakup song, but when I played it on Spotify and listened to it, much different. The lyrics are about losing someone, but that we'll be walking hand in hand again in the land that knows no parting. In the afterlife, in other words. I knew as I heard it that it was a direct message. Also, he came to me in a dream. You know the difference between if it's just a vision or a dream, and this was the only actual visit. For about a year after he died, the standing lamp in my living room would come on its own every now and then. I would just say, "Hi, Dad." One night while I was taking the dog out before bed, it was a full moon in February of 2020 about midnight, I witnessed a small rock being kicked toward me out in the street in front of my house. There was no wind that night, and even if there were, wind doesn't blow rocks, much less uphill. He always rather liked to kick rocks if he passed them as we walked the dog, so it seems like a dad way to reach out. So I said, "Hi, Dad." I kept the rock. But the most recent things left me with some very sweet keepsakes. First, he left an orange heart in my robe pocket. I don't wear my robe outside the house anywhere. I have no idea how it got there, just a little paper cutout of a heart. Orange was his favorite color. He loved bright colors. I said, "I love you too, Daddy." I taped it to my bathroom mirror to remind me that he is still okay and that he still loves me. Then, about a month later, my hubby and I were cuddling one weekend morning, and we heard a loud bang from the garage downstairs. We didn't realize what it was until later in the day. I saw the back door had been slammed open somehow, and had been open all day long. I closed the door and mused about how odd that it was that it had opened with such force when it hadn't been windy, and that there were no vibrations or anything. The next day I go to do laundry. The machine is in the garage, and at my feet in front of the washing machine is a yellow felt heart with sheet music cut out in a heart shape glued to the front of it. My dad was a pianist, and music was everything to him. It was a little dirty. I can't imagine where he got it from, or what it had to blow through to get to my garage door. I think he opened the door the day before so that he could get that heart in there somehow. It was just above and beyond. I don't know how hard it is to do that kind of thing from the other side, but I just feel so very loved that he went to the trouble and found a way somehow. I taped that one to my mirror as well. Lastly, on my parents' anniversary this January, Mom woke up to a light on in the living room. It was the light on the wall that used to hang above Dad's recliner, an old-fashioned looking one with 2 separate bulbs. He loved that light. He had it on a little remote plug and everything. When he got ALS, I put it on a smart plug so that he could tell Alexa to turn it on for him, until talking became too difficult anyway. but it stopped working with Alexa right after he died. So Mom hasn't turned it on herself since then because she has back pain and can't be bending over to rotate the little switch that's on the cord. After a couple years off, suddenly it was on their anniversary. She left it on all day. After an entire year alone, mostly because of COVID, I think she especially needed that sign that he was still with her. It was the first physical sign that she's ever gotten from him, and it's proof that love never really dies. I was babysitting one night for a family friend about 4 years ago. I had put the kids to bed and crashed on the couch while waiting for my mom and the friend to get back from a night out. Randomly, I woke up and just remember being very confused about why I was even awake. That was, until I heard the front door close. A key thing to note here is the fact that the only sound was the door closing. There was no sound of it being locked, and this lock was very loud. I assumed it was my mom and her friend coming back, so I sat up, preparing to leave. However, I quickly noticed the lack of their voices. They are never quiet after a night out, especially because the friend always has some drinks. And I also noticed that there was only one set of footsteps. For a moment, I considered the possibility of it being the friend's husband coming home to grab something. He is a firefighter and was at the station for one of his 24-hour shifts. I could hear the person walking around the front room and then going to the table in there and shuffling through papers as if frantically searching for something. The more I listened, though, the more it just didn't feel right. I pretty quickly dropped the idea of it being the husband and jumped to the idea that it was an intruder. Being around 15 at the time, I was in no way brave enough to confront any intruder that broke into the house. I barely managed to scoot along a wall leading to the front room before becoming completely paralyzed by fear. I ended up promising myself that I would keep my presence hidden until the person walked upstairs to the kids or back toward me. I could hear them pacing around a lot, papers and items being shuffled through. Eventually, I heard the footsteps start to come down the hall before turning into the bathroom, which was before they could reach me or the stairs. Only seconds after the footsteps walked into the bathroom, I heard the front door unlock. This ties back to the beginning because it really stuck out that the door was never locked, and I can remember every single sound from the second that I woke up. Immediately, I heard my mom and the friend talking loudly, and part of me was relieved, while the other part of me was prepared to hear them screaming upon finding an intruder in the bathroom that was too small to hide in. Shockingly, they just walked straight past it, and my mom told me to get my stuff so that we could go home. I was still listening the entire time, and the bathroom door never closed and no further footsteps were heard. As I finally walked down the hall to the door, I scanned the bathroom. The door was wide open, the window was shut and too small to fit anyone but kids through, and there was nobody crouched in the darkness. There was absolutely nothing off about the house. No windows open in any of the first floor, and nobody left between my mom coming back and us leaving. Nothing. I'm a skeptic. I like to think that this may have been an intruder, but I cannot think of any logical way that they could have hid in the short minute that it took for me to walk by, nor did they have an escape route. The friend never found an intruder or noticed any missing items. Nothing makes sense. All I know is that night is vividly ingrained in my mind, too vividly to be a dream. And I still get that feeling of something not being right when I think about it. I was around 12 when I had gotten a babysitting job with a family across town. The family was new to the area and just recently bought the house next to my best friend's place. My first day over was to get familiar with the kids and the house. The parents stayed and evaluated me and of course answered any questions that I had. I spent my time playing and keeping the children occupied. It was a boy named Devin, age 4, and a girl named Cameron, age 7, so I had my work cut out for me. Cameron wanted me to go to her room so she could show me her toys. I followed her up the 2 flights of stairs, but as we came to the top of the stairs, I felt strangely lightheaded, and the hair on my arms rose up. I had an intense feeling of being watched, like there was someone else up there with us. I tried to ignore the sensation and continue with my duties of finding Cameron's favorite doll so that we could go back downstairs. At the end of the day, it was decided that I was a good match, and I was to come back on Saturday morning. As I headed home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I got from that upstairs. I told myself, it's nothing, and I brushed it off to just being in a new place and unfamiliar surroundings. That Saturday morning, I showed up to a busy home as the parents tried to get out the door and show me the last-minute things that I needed for the day ahead. The kids were up in their PJs eating breakfast and already talking to me about all the fun things they wanted to do. After the parents left, I ushered the kids off to get changed. As I was cleaning up the breakfast dishes, I heard a loud bang come from the dining room. I ran back into the room and found one of the false ceiling tiles had fallen from its place. Puzzled, I tried to put it back, but it was not an easy task. After some struggling, I managed to fit it back in and thought to myself, how could that have fallen out on its own? The day went on, and now it's close to lunchtime. The kids are watching TV, and I'm in the kitchen making something for lunch when I heard another loud bang coming from the dining area again. I look, and sure enough, the same tile was on the floor. This time, I left it for the parents to see when they got home. Maybe they can fix it, I thought. Now the kids wanted to play hide and seek. We started off with Cameron seeking, and myself and Devin hiding. As Cameron started to count, we scurried around trying to find the best hiding place. I found the downstairs bathroom to be the best place for me. It was easy enough for Cameron to find me, and I hid Devin close to me so that I could keep an eye on him. As I entered the bathroom, I closed the door quietly behind me. I walked a few steps into the room and was now facing the mirror. As I was looking at my reflection, I also noticed something behind me that was moving. It was the closet door directly behind me, slowly opening. The closet door opened halfway and then slowly closed again, all by itself. I had the same feeling come over me like I did when I was upstairs on my first day. Wide-eyed with fear, I turned to the bathroom door and ran out. All I could think was, what just happened? I was really starting to worry that this house was haunted, and I now had every horror movie that I had ever watched playing through my head. Now I'm finding that I'm really uncomfortable, but I decide it's best to keep occupied. I break out a board game for us to play on the living room floor. Hungry Hippo, I think it was. We were playing for around 20 minutes before I noticed something again out of the corner of my eye, moving. I turned my head to see what it was. A child's shoe was tumbling across the floor all by itself. The kids stopped and watched in confusion. I was in disbelief. Cameron let out a scream and she ran for the door. I grabbed up Devin and followed. We went to my friend's house next door and told her mom everything. I'm not sure if she believed me, but we stayed over there until the parents got home. When they showed up, we told them what we saw. I don't think they believed me either. I showed the panel that fell out. Apparently it's been an issue since they moved in, and as for the rest of my accounts, they chalked it up to an overly active imagination. I know what I saw and what I felt. I wasn't imagining anything. I later found out a bit of history on the house. Apparently, a man died in the house after a heart attack upstairs in a room above the dining room where the paneling kept falling out. I think that his spirit is still in that house, and that maybe he was just trying to play with us. This story took place when I was a kid. My dad has been a pool man for many years. One of his oldest customers decided to purchase a ranch. I don't exactly remember where. He asked my dad if he could come and fix their pool, which was disastrously maintained before he bought it. He gave my dad permission to bring us along, and told us we were welcome to stay a few days to enjoy the ranch. We drove there, and I had been in charge of reading the MapQuest instructions because I never seemed to be able to sleep during car trips. We drove back home a few days later after my dad was finally able to save the pool. The drive home was very long. For whole stretches, the view was mostly desert, farms, and the occasional suburban town. Unlike me, my mom and brothers knocked out almost immediately. So most of the trip, it was just my dad and I talking or listening to music. I'm also a very avid reader, so I had a book on my lap beside the maps. I remember the ride had been quiet for a while because I had been reading. I had to stop because it was getting dark, and my dad only let me turn on the dome lights to read the maps. No radio service, and the Game Boy's batteries had all died. All I had left to do was look outside. All of a sudden, I spotted a very tall shadow on a roof. I recognized that there was a man who seemed to be wearing a hat, bowler or top hat, dancing and jumping from roof to roof of this suburban lot. It was kind of like the scene from Singing in the Rain, which at that point I had not seen yet. It took a second to realize that it wasn't a normal thing to just happen. The houses were separated in a way where a normal person couldn't possibly have jumped roof to roof. What scared me the most is how at the last house before a field he seemed to turn around and sense me. He bowed and tipped his hat. Even though I couldn't see it, I could sense him smiling. All I felt was dread. I turned to face my dad to see if he had seen him as well, but he had been paying attention to the road. When I turned back, I couldn't see the houses anymore. They were way behind us. I never saw a face or any details. He was just a silhouette on the roofs. I remember feeling afraid that he might follow us, or that he could if he wanted to. I never saw something like that on our many road trips ever again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it, but it felt so real. The memory is very vivid as well, which always comes back when I'm watching old musicals because the dancing reminds me of the way that he moved. I'm employed as a policeman, and I work the night shift in a tiny little town. The population here barely breaks 1,000. Needless to say, I know the town well enough to be able to tell when something is wrong. Near the center of the town, there's the old school they used before they built the new elementary and high schools. The building is listed as a historical site and can't be demolished, but due to asbestos, renovations would cost the town too much to be worth the work. This school sits within feet of the public library, and behind it sits the town's fairground. It isn't an official fairground, but every year they had bull riding and small shows that they would put on for kids during the summer. With all of those details out of the way, I will explain what happened. I noticed the backlight to the library on, which is not normal since it wasn't on all night, and it isn't a motion light, so I parked on the north side of the old school grounds. I walked through the fence and had to pass the school to get to the library. I would stop every few feet and listen because the gravel was so loud. When I stopped the second or third time, I thought I heard a squeal in the school, like the sound of a door. At first, I didn't think anything of it, since I figured I was hearing things. The town just replaced all the windows on this building, so I thought I wouldn't be able to hear the inside. When I investigated the light and found all the doors locked, I started walking back around to my car. As I passed by the school again, I heard a noise in the building again, and I stopped and listened. And as I shined my light, I noticed a basement window was broken out. So when I walked up to the window, I looked down and in and didn't see anything. I kept walking, and I heard the squeal again. It reminded me of those bathroom doors in schools that the hinges always squealed really loud and echoed. When I came around the corner, I saw 2 cats roughhousing in the dirt. They stopped to watch me, and then both of them turned and looked at the door. I couldn't see for myself because it was around another corner. One hissed, and they both bolted away from the school, which put me on edge. I know this school is absolutely not in use, nor are there any plans to use this school anytime soon. Also, the local kids and homeless don't come here, ever. It's a landmark the city as a whole really admires, and there hasn't ever been an issue with breaking and entering, at least not for a long time. So when I came around the corner, I saw the door and I walked up to it to see what the cats had run from. I looked for other animals, but that didn't make sense because they looked up as if someone were standing in the window of the door. Not like they would if it were a raccoon or a dog that ran off without me seeing. When I looked in the window with my light, I could see a gigantic Raggedy Ann painted on the wall, and I assumed this was the kindergarten section or something. And then I stepped back from the door getting ready to leave, and I heard whistling. It wasn't really loud, but it was loud enough to make me stop. That little voice in the back of my head was talking now and telling me I was just hearing things, but the dude that likes the dump of fear of the unknown told me to go back to the door. So I went back and listened again, and I know it was whistling, and not like the squeak of an animal or an object from inside. It got louder when I came to the door again, and it had a tune, but I don't know how to describe it. So now, thinking someone is in the school, I went around and checked all the doors, including the second floor door that I had to climb the rusty metal stairs that were more like a death trap to see in through. When I couldn't find a way into the school, I checked it all over again, and when I left, I couldn't figure out what it was. The whistling had stopped, and I even hung around outside for a few minutes without my light on, just watching, figuring out if someone was in there. They would eventually need to use a light to get around, or to get back out, but there was nothing after 20 or so minutes. So I got in my car, circled the block, and parked down the way with my lights off to watch for someone to come out at some point. But no one did, and there haven't been any lights on. I know this story seems kind of boring compared to the others, but working nights gets you on edge. And for all the things I know I experienced before, this was in my top 5 bone-chilling moments while on the job. So for some backstory, my mother has breast cancer, and before our town got a cancer treatment center at the hospital, my mother would have to travel to a city 4 hours away to get treatment. At times, this would be 3 days. She would leave, get treated, and then come back on the 3rd day. At this time, my brother was in his early teens and was going through that rebellious stage of his life. So guess who gets called to look after him when my mother does her treatments? Day 1. My mother leaves early, about 6 in the morning, and tells me that she would send me a text message once she gets to her hotel. I came around yesterday so that my mother could leave early and told her to have a safe trip. Eventually, my brother wakes up to get ready for school. This is on a Friday. I give him his lunch, and he's off. I spend my day just sitting around my mother's house, giving her cat some attention, giving the dog some food, watching TV. The basics, really. Sure enough, my brother returns back from school and we do the typical brother things. Night comes, he goes to bed, and I stay up for a little while watching TV. About 10, I turn it off and make my way to the spare room where I was staying while Mom was away. I get underneath the blanket and close my eyes. As I could feel myself on the verge of sleep, I hear it. Thud, 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 thud. It was the sound of footsteps, as though someone was quickly moving back and forth through the living room. My eyes shot open, and my thoughts quickly went to burglar. Someone was in my mother's house, moving around, trying to find something to steal. But as I listen, I notice something else. I would hear it, then a pause, and then again, like someone was running back and forth, only stopping for a moment just to do it all over. The sound was too light for a grown person, but sounded more like that of a child. I sighed, believing this to be my brother. My mom had told me before she left about how my brother would sneak out of his room to grab his phone or Game Boy and play it when he was meant to be sleeping. Thinking this was the case, I get out of bed and make my way into the living room. As I did, the noise stopped. I continued on up to my brother's room. I opened the door and peeked in. He looked like he was sleeping, but looks can be deceiving. I returned to the living room and I decided to pretend to have fallen asleep on the couch so that I could catch my brother in action. Somehow I actually did fall asleep. I awoke to something brushing my nose. Turns out it was the dog. I look around to see the slightest of light coming in the windows. If I had to guess, it was maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. Tired, I get up and make my way back to bed. Once again, as I felt myself about to drift off, the noises started up again. In my tired state, I just concluded that it must be possums in the roof, and went back to sleep. Day 2. It was Saturday, so I let my brother sleep in. The lazy butthole didn't get up until 11. It went well. We hung out, had lunch, played some games, nothing really major. Well, not until that night. Once again, I stayed up while my brother went to bed, and again, around 10, I turned the TV off and went to go to sleep. Sure enough, just as I was about to drift off, thud, 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 thud. Those darn possums, I moaned to myself. Then I heard a little girl giggle. My eyes shot open after hearing that, and the running resumed. I sat up, hearing the playful running back and forth in the living room. I just sat there trying to figure out where this little girl's giggle had come from. It sounded like a 7 or a 10-year-old. I turned to the window, seeing the next-door neighbor's light still on. I began to think that the noise I was hearing was coming from them, that maybe they had a little girl over and she was just being a pest. It was a good possibility, except for one thing. The couple who lived there were old and didn't have any grandkids. I heard that giggle again, much clearer now, like it was just in the living room, which was just outside my door. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. Day 3. That morning I was uneasy, but was glad that my mother was returning. About 1 p.m. she got back home, and I began to pack up to return home myself, but the events of the past 2 nights still stuck with me as I returned back to her. Getting the courage, I asked her if she had ever heard a little girl in that house. "Oh, her?" my mother states. "Yeah, she's quite a mischievous one, isn't she?" I just smiled and left. I spent other nights there looking after my brother, but never heard from her again, and when my mother moved to another house with another ghost, I felt like she traded one for another. But that's a different story. When I was a little kid, I was pretty much fearless. I was out catching snakes barehanded before I was even in 1st grade. I got in lots of fights because I never backed down from older bullies. I once climbed up the outside of a 5-story building when I was in 2nd grade just because I looked at the blocks in the corner and thought, I could probably do that. When I was in 4th grade, I lived in a small little one-horse town in Ohio, population 1,500. It was the kind of small town where everyone knows everyone else, and knows everyone else's business. When I was in the 4th grade, my older sister, by 2.5 years, and I went out trick-or-treating. This is back in the days when you could go out trick-or-treating so long that you would have to come back home and dump your bag out at some point before going back out. Everything was going completely normal, and we were having a great time in spite of the fact that she and I don't really get along that well. We came up to a house and knocked on the door. A woman answered. Before we could even say trick or treat, I was hit with such a wave of absolute terror that I immediately turned and ran away as fast as I could. When I got about a block away, my fear had subsided and I realized that I had left my sister behind. When I turned around, she was running toward me, about 30 paces behind. I was embarrassed to admit that I had been scared to death, and simply tried to pretend like I had run away because she did and passed her because I was much faster. I asked her, "Why did you run away?" She didn't seem to realize that I had run away before her, and looked bewildered and simply said, "I don't know, I was scared for my life." Having her admit her fear allowed me to admit mine as well. I had been in many near-death situations and more than once thought that I was going to die, but I have never in my life felt such absolute, complete terror. Neither of us had any explanation for it. This wasn't some haunted house on the edge of town. It was just a normal house on a normal street. The woman who had answered the door did not say or do anything that could have frightened us. She didn't look scary or threatening in any way. She looked just like any other average housewife that would have been in someone's living room in the town at that time. To my recollection, she did not say or do anything at all. She simply opened the door, and the minute we saw her, we were both filled with complete and utter terror. Again, I have no explanation for this, nor does my sister. I finally talked my friend into moving from Seattle to Texas. We decided to split the move into 2 parts, the first one last week, moving her stuff in a rented SUV. We both had some time, and we decided to take the trip on all the back roads. We stayed at a mineral springs resort in the middle of nowhere in Oregon that was amazing. On the second day, we got up to drive to Vegas. We took US 50, which is known as the loneliest highway in America. I will admit that before this, it had been 8 to 10 hours before we had had any human contact. I am a former over-the-road trucker and a US veteran, so I'm used to traveling to different places and being in new surroundings every day, but it also taught me to listen to my instincts. Let me tell you, did they come in loud and clear while on this trip a few hours away from Vegas we stopped to get gas. As we rolled into the place, I just thought it looked aged, very dated. My friend decided to get gas. I walked inside to look at the place and get some snacks. I can honestly say that I can't point to any one thing that was wrong, but the feeling that overcame me was indescribable. It basically told me that the place was, well, the phrase that I would use is out of place, and that I needed to go right then. Now, I'll admit that this could be my own experience, and maybe because I had such a bad feeling that I was imagining things, but the minute I decided to leave, without buying anything or even using the restroom, I swear everybody in the place started looking at me. And I don't mean just the employees, but the patrons. I walked quickly to my car and told my friend that if she believed in instincts, that we should just get in the car and leave right that second. We did, and we did not breathe easy until we were about 10 miles away. That was my spooky encounter in the middle of Death Valley. I've been a babysitter a bunch of times. Sometimes I take care of the kids of my mom's friends, other times I take care of my little cousins. I really liked to babysit all of my kids, because it usually went smoothly and none of them were problematic to deal with. One time I was babysitting my little cousins, who at the time were 6, 4, 2, and 5 months old. My aunt told me that the baby monitor needed new batteries, so I decided to just check on the baby from time to time. The night went as usual. The bigger kids ate dinner, played a bit, then watched some cartoons, and fell asleep a few minutes after. I was downstairs just texting with some friends and tried to listen carefully in case my baby cousin made any sounds. For most of the night, I thought I heard the baby making sounds, so I kept going in there and checking on him. I believed it was just my mind playing tricks on me, probably because I was on high alert, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, the 2-year-old woke up crying because of a nightmare, so I grabbed him and let him lay on my chest until he fell asleep, and then I tucked him into bed again. A few minutes passed, and I heard the baby screaming, so I ran upstairs and did what I could to calm him down so that the other kids wouldn't wake up. As soon as I get to the door, the screaming stops, and when I entered the bedroom to check on him, he was sound asleep. I freaked out and checked everything in the nursery, hoping to find some kind of toy with a similar sound, but there was nothing. I immediately went and checked on the other kids, praying that they were okay. Fortunately, all 4 kids were asleep, and it appeared to have not disturbed anyone. Still, I made sure everything was all right, and that nothing had actually made a sound. I was kind of surprised that the scream hadn't woken any of the other kids up, but at the same time I was thankful for it, because I didn't want the other kids to be scared in their own house, and also I wouldn't know how to explain what had happened to my aunt and uncle without freaking them out. I didn't hear any other sounds for the rest of the night, until my aunt and uncle came home. I decided to not say anything, and just take the money and go home. A few years ago, a friend and I took a road trip across country. We stopped at an out-of-the-way place in Wyoming late at night. As soon as we rolled up, we both felt as if it were haunted, but really needed to sleep, so we checked in and put anything paranormal out of our minds. The place was very run down. We had 2 beds in our room. Mine was closest to the door and window with a nightstand in between us. Also, we each had a little lamp above our beds. I laid down, clicked off my lamp, and was facing the window. While lying down, I saw a black, shadowy figure cross the length of the wall and then vanish. About 30 seconds later, after I had laid my head down, my friend began playing with my hair. I sat upright and said, "What the?" But she was in her bed, 5 feet away, reading her book. I didn't say anything because, as mentioned, we just wanted to sleep. Later that night, my friend woke me and asked if she could sleep in my bed with me. I said yes, but didn't ask why. That morning, we had confession time. I told her that I thought that she was playing with my hair, that's why I sat up in bed before falling asleep. She said that she had looked over and saw a black, shadowy figure hovering above me at the moment when I had looked up. During the night, after she had turned her light off, someone was playing with her feet, rubbing them, massaging them, etc. She couldn't get any sleep and was freaked out, which is why she cowered over to my bed. That morning, we asked the waitress in the very creepy stuffed animal heads on the wall, dark, musty coffee shop if the place was haunted. She said she wasn't allowed to comment on that. We pressured her to tell us the history of the place. She told us that the hotel used to be POW bunkers, where the Chinese had been held or something like that, around World War II. Anyway, I've wanted to go back for a while, and I'm wondering, have any of you had similar experiences? The hotel was in Wyoming, well off the beaten path. This story took place during my childhood when I was about 12 years old. A few days ago I thought about it, and still don't know exactly what it was, and what I should think. It's not the most spectacular story, but anyway. I grew up in an apartment that was pretty outside the city and close to a forest. We had a lot of greenery around, and we were always playing and sometimes also camping outside with friends during the summer. So one night, me and 2 friends decided to build my tent and sleep outside. We were always then staying up really long and telling ghost stories. While we did this, we suddenly heard noises from outside the tent. We were all holding our breath. Then we could hear steps. They came closer and closer, and then the steps even went around our tent before stopping. We got really scared and said, "Whoever you are, go away or we will call the police." It seemed to work because the steps continued and headed away from our tent. After a minute or so, we then tried to be brave and go outside the tent to see who it might have been. Then, when we looked out, we saw a woman, dressed in a long, white gown, walking away in the dark. I still don't know who or what she was, but it continues to give me chills. When I was growing up, there had been a few forests around town that had famous stories linked to them. The people believed that the forests were cursed from the Native American tribes who were relocated from their homes way back when. They said that the forests belonged to them, and when you go in and ignore your gut feeling, those people die in those woods. When my dad and my sister and I moved when I was around 13 or so, we moved to a small town. Across the street was a hill, and at the top stood a blue water tower. I used to hang out in the woods across the street from my house. It was quiet, and the birds always chirped. Other kids were scared of the woods, but I went up there to draw and listen to the birds. Also, because it was at the top of a hill, I could look out and see the entire town and feel the breeze. But when the animals went quiet, it was time to go. When the school year started, I found out that it was an ancient Indian burial ground. Every year our class would go up the hill and learn about it, and the town and the school was actually really respectful of the forest and the hill. We took care of the trees there. If you looked at the ground, you could still see a lot of Native American arrowheads. We never took them home, though, and were not supposed to. I didn't, at least. I would actually go into the forest when I was walking home because the bullies were too scared to go in. I felt safe there, but I also had to remember to respect it. In the forest, we also had wood piles. When we would go into the forest, we would make piles for the local foxes to nest in during the winter time. Once I went to school after retreating into the forest from one of my bullies the other day. A couple of my classmates ran up to me and said, "What did you do, Jacob?" I looked at the kid and said, "Nothing, why?" They looked at each other and said, "Well, something scared him, and we thought you had scared him, in the woods." I said, "I didn't scare him, I just went in there to hang out." It was the time that Jacob threw a rock at me, and I remember it landed to my right, and I hurried up my pace in the woods, and I thought that he had left at that point, like he always did. He screamed "raccoon" at me, and when I reached the top of the hill, I cried and went home because for some reason that time the bullying hurt. Whatever happened to Jacob in the woods, I'll never know. He stopped bullying me from that day forward and said sorry to me and that it would never happen again. He did say something happened in the woods, but he never said by what or who, just had a look of terror and practically begged me to accept his apology. I told him it's all right and I went on my way. He could never look me in the eye again. That was back in middle school. When I went to college, I saw him at a 4th of July college event. I was going to catch up with him about life and put the bullying behind us. He glanced, but still looked so uneasy that I simply walked by. Also, sometimes my sister would walk home with me after school. Only once or twice that I can recall. Every time we entered the woods, she felt lost. I even had her lead us, and she couldn't follow the trail. It's like she kept seeing these invisible trails that went in circles. She started to breathe heavy and cry and said we were lost, and she had an anxiety attack and just told me that we had to get out of the woods. I was totally chill, and knew the forest pretty well, and I let us out, and it was easy. It was literally just 3 trails, one from the south, one from the north, and one going up the hill to our house. You could get in and out of the forest in under 10 minutes from one side to the other. I had a strange babysitting experience the other night. Everything was normal until the kids were in bed, and so I was just scrolling through random vids on Instagram to pass the time. I was watching one, and I heard something. It was as if a man or one of the boys pretending to have a deep voice was upstairs said "no" or something in a weirdly growly voice. I was confused and a little spooked, so I brushed it off and sat on the couch to watch a movie. Their dog was walking around and growling at the windows that led to the backyard. That creeped me out too, but again I just brushed it off as the dog seeing a squirrel or something. At this point it's around 10 p.m. He then was laying on my lap and started growling and barking toward the kitchen. At this point I was like, come on man, you better cut that out. Because who on earth wouldn't be creeped out by that? Later, I heard these incredibly light, whispery voices like children. I wasn't completely sure if it was just the kids waking up and making noise, but it only lasted for a moment after I noticed. I noticed those weird things, but I really didn't put them together until later that night. I talked to my mom after, and she told me that my sister and her friend had babysat there as well, and they both had an odd experience, i.e. bad vibes, the kids telling her that she's seen some things, and the kids actually addressing something that wasn't there. My mom didn't tell me before so that I wouldn't be spooked, which I guess was good because I got an independent witness of whatever happened without being influenced by other people's experiences. But anyways, that's what took place. I'll still go back and babysit. I'll just be prepared to throw hands with Casper. My father is a policeman. He's a no-nonsense guy who lives very much in the here and now and believes only in what he can see and feel or hear for himself. At the time of this story, he was in the police force for more than 20 years, and I was a teenager. My father worked night shifts, and on a regular basis he would come home early in the morning to have breakfast with us. He would then go to bed, and we would go to school. He was usually in a good mood and would tell us funny or interesting stories from his day or night at work. At this particular morning, he was unusually silent, and he didn't eat either. My mother asked if he felt all right. It took him a while to actually answer, and he said, "I'm not sure what I experienced tonight." He didn't want to say any more in front of us kids, but we prodded him long enough until he told us the following. It had been a quiet night, and he was out with his colleague in a police car. At some point they were informed over the radio that a car chase was going on not far from them, and their assistance was required. They drove off toward the chase, and soon caught up with the suspect's vehicle. The radio had informed them that 2 men were in the front seat of the car. My father's car pulled up almost beside the car so that he managed to get a good look at the inside. He saw the 2 men in the front arguing heatedly with each other, and then he saw another man in the back. He had no hair and was so pale that he almost seemed white. He was dressed in all black. He looked directly at my father, his face almost pressed against the window with very dark eyes, and he grinned widely. My father was deeply unsettled by this person. He seemed to look directly into my father's eyes. My father was so sure of this third person that he informed the other police cars about him. The chase ended with the car crashing into a fence and the suspects fleeing into a field. They were apprehended only minutes later. There were 2 men. Not 3. My father asked his colleagues at the scene if they were sure that there hadn't been a third guy. No one else had seen him. "I can't explain it," he said to us. "I saw him clear as day, and he grinned at me like death himself." This took place in 2004-2005 in Germany. To this day, we have no logical explanation for what he really saw and experienced. This happened about 2 weeks ago while my brother and his wife were at a party. My own wife and I get called to babysit my nephews and nieces for these sorts of moments by all of my siblings. In this instance, when we were asked to babysit my 5-year-old nephew, his 3-year-old sister, and his 6-month-old brother, we happily obliged. They live in a newish 10-year-old house, and the only significant location near it is an important cultural site for the local Cree peoples about 10 kilometers away. The hard work was done for us, as the 5 and 3-year-old were asleep upstairs before we arrived. The baby was not fussy but would not sleep, so we were hanging out with him on the main floor. As the night dragged on, around 10:30 I heard a baby crying upstairs. Thinking the 3-year-old must have woken, I left the happy baby with my wife and went to check on our niece. My wife heard the crying as well and asked me to go check. On my way up the flights of stairs, I definitely heard crying from that floor, and I pushed my head into the kids' room to listen. The crying was still going on, but both kids were sound asleep. The sound was coming from across the hall, the nursery, so being quite confused, I moved toward that room. The crying ceased about midway between the door and the crib. Seeing the room was empty, I immediately began trying to explain it to myself. I picked up the baby monitor unit in the room to make sure that it wasn't picking up an errant signal from another house. It was not on, and didn't have a speaker anyways. There were no toys that made that noise around, and no TVs or devices that might play those noises in the room. I stuck around to listen a while longer, but nothing came of it. My wife was baffled and a little spooked, as she had clearly heard the crying as well. Nothing happened the rest of that night, and my nephew is still just the same wonderful kid that he has always been, so I guess no harm, no foul, spooky ghost. My brother and his wife went white when I told them about it at Christmas, but to my knowledge, it is the only thing like that that has ever happened in their house. His house has no history and had also been smudged, so no advice is necessary from anyone. I just thought y'all might appreciate a wholesome, unexplained experience. I recently went bush camping with my boyfriend on Crown Land near Stone Mills, Ontario. It was our first time doing bush camping, so I sent a video of our campsite set up to a friend. Days after this happened, I talked to my friend, who asked me about the ghost in the video that I was completely unaware of since I didn't take a second look at it after sending. When I had that closer look, I zoomed in to see a terrifying skeleton-like figure. At first, I thought it was a glare on the lens from the fire, but the figure is moving way quicker than the speed of the camera. This place was very deserted, but throughout the night, I heard clear footsteps that sounded human. So much so that I thought that the cops had come to kick us out when I saw a flashlight point at us from the woods. I quickly pointed my light back, but never saw any animals or people. I have been camping a lot and have had deer, squirrels, and raccoons come to my campsite, and their footsteps did not sound like the ones that I had heard. I'm not a believer of the paranormal or anything of the sort, so I didn't even think about it until watching the actual footage. In the fall of 2019, I started babysitting for a new family. They live in a house built in the 1920s. I've always believed in angels and demons, not necessarily just ghosts. One of the first times that I was babysitting the 3-year-old and the 1-year-old, I was putting them to bed and I thought that I heard someone knocking on their front door downstairs. I looked out the window to see if the parents were home, but there was no one there. I decided to just ignore it. Another time, again, I was putting them to bed, and I heard what sounded like a man and a woman having a conversation in the kitchen. Again, I looked to see if the parents had just gotten home. They hadn't. Another time, I was watching them during the day when the mom was out of town and the dad was at work. I expected him home around 3:30. The girls were napping upstairs, and I heard the kitchen door open and footsteps. I was surprised the dad was back so early. As I turned the corner to go and greet him in the kitchen, I saw what I thought was him, black suit and all, walk past the door frame. I entered the kitchen and started to say, "Didn't expect you back so early." But there was no one there. The last time I ever babysat them, I was playing in the backyard with the girls. Let me remind you that the oldest one is 3. She is constantly scared to be alone or in the dark, which I thought was strange because usually at such a young age, kids haven't had any experiences to make them this frightened. She said to me that day, "I saw Slender Man in my bathroom mirror, and he waved back at me." I was terrified. I asked her to repeat what she had just said multiple times. Slender Man. She is 3. There's no reason for her to already know what that means. At that moment, I realized that I had always closed her bathroom door just because it felt creepy. And when I would come back to the room later, the door was always opened. I've never babysat for them again. My university was in a remote location surrounded by a river. It was almost like an island, very isolated, and during the weekend all the locals would go home, making it more eerie. This happened in 2014 when I was 22 years old. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, so I decided to sleep in my friend's room. Around 1 a.m. I woke up feeling thirsty. My friend was studying, so I decided to walk to my room and bring the water bottle as my room was on the other side of the corridor. There was an elevator at the end of the corridor, which played soft music, and you would know if the elevator was on your floor. So I walked toward my room, and as I turned right toward the corridor, I saw an unknown girl staring at the elevator without moving. First of all, I didn't know who she was, because we can usually tell which year a student is, especially after spending 3 to 4 years in the same place and looking at the same faces every day. Secondly, the girl was wearing denim jeans, sports shoes, and was carrying a backpack as if she had just come back from her class. What's strange about that is that the hostel door closes at 8 p.m. The girl was looking straight at the elevator buttons without even blinking. The elevator was still on our floor, so why wasn't she getting on? I could see the side of her face. It was a very strange stare. I don't know how to explain it. I automatically stopped walking after seeing her and got goosebumps all over my body. Something was stopping me from taking my steps forward. I stood there and watched her for about a minute. After that, I went running to my friend's room and asked her if she recognized the lady. When she came back, she wasn't there, and the elevator music was still playing. My friend didn't believe me, and I still don't know who or what that was. This happened 30 years ago when I was about 14 years old, and me and an older friend were babysitting for a 6-year-old girl and her younger brother. We had been told that sometimes the girl complains about seeing a ghost man in her bedroom and upstairs at night, and that he comes out through the attic door. Now, I didn't believe a word of it. Kids are weird and say weird things. We get the kids ready for bed, but they wouldn't settle. The girl said that she felt scared, and her little brother started crying. She asked if she could sleep in her mom's bed until she got home. The little brother wanted to go with her. So I tucked them in and told some silly stories and laughed until they were both tired. Both kids were virtually asleep when we left. Door ajar, hall light on. An hour later, we're sitting downstairs watching The Equalizer, and all was good. Kids were definitely asleep, as I had to sneak past their room to use the bathroom. I had a quick peek on my way back, and aside from the little brother snoring a bit, everything else was quiet. I go back downstairs, and we watch TV a bit more. About 20 minutes go by, and out of nowhere we hear banging. Heavy, heavy banging, and the kids are screaming immediately. I run up the stairs and meet the kids as they're running out of the room. More banging, and this time I have eyes on the kids, so I know that they're not making the noise. The kids fly at me. I grab the little brother, and we rush downstairs into the front room, shut the door, and all crash onto the sofa. Everything is silent apart from the TV, which I switch off. We sit in silence for about 5 minutes, just sorta holding each other. After a bit, the girl, with tears in her eyes, just says in a matter-of-fact way, the man was angry because she wasn't in her own room, so he tried to push over a wardrobe, and then he started thumping the wall. This event has stayed with me all these years. My wife and I were camping last night in Blue River Reservoir in Oregon. We camp here often and decided to explore up FSR 520 and found a cool, abandoned bridge far back in the woods over Cook Creek. The spot was beautiful, and we were set up over the river on this long, abandoned bridge. If you've ever been in the Oregon woods, you know that they can give off a creepy vibe, and this was no exception. But it really was a dream campsite. Being 40 feet directly over a river while on a bridge with limbs growing everywhere over it isn't your everyday spot. I'll throw in for background that there was no one within at least 3 miles of us, and we had to hike our way in, approximately 1/10 of a mile from where we had parked. We explored around the area for a bit, and didn't come across anything out of the ordinary besides a pair of shoes and a name, Mona, written in ash on a rock of the fire ring. While we were sitting by the fire, I noticed a very bright flash of light over the river and snapped my head up, but didn't see anything. A few moments later, I was paying closer attention and watched a ball of light float, even with the bridge 40 feet in the air, from one side to the other in the woods over 50 feet. The light was very blue. My thought at first had been somehow that headlights had come through, but I would have heard a car and no man-made light could get to us in this isolated area. This blue light was unlike anything I had ever seen. I mentioned it to my wife, but didn't want to freak her out, so I dropped the subject soon after. Later that night in the tent, we had the mesh lining up where we could see outside. My wife gasped and watched as the same blue light floated at the end of the bridge 30 feet away and hovered in the air. After a good bit of time, it shot off into the woods. It being late at night, we were obviously scared of someone's headlamp, but it shot away 40 times as quickly as any human could go, and we saw nothing attached. Our dog left the tent and stared at that exact spot for the next 10+ minutes, while also peeking down the side of the bridge very seriously. I traveled quite a bit when I was younger, specifically in the Pacific Northwest of the US, as that's where I'm from. Whenever my single mother, older sister, and I took a break at the various rest stops along the way, I was almost always met by an older woman, likely in her 50s, early 60s. She offered my sister and I a variety of treats, generally hot cocoa and cookies, or lemonade depending on the weather. We always took it graciously. I think my mom assumed that we always bought the things with our allowance at the little shop that's sometimes integrated into the rest stop buildings. But I always remember that woman being at a white plastic table with black legs and never charging us any money. She never spoke. She was the highlight of many trips. I always felt safe and attribute her presence with my love for road trips and rest stops in general. Well, I brought her up a few years back in conversation with my mom and sister, and while my sister seemed to remember her, my mom did not, and pointed out how ridiculous that would be. I honestly hadn't thought much of it since I was 8 or 9, and just took her to be part of the travel experience. But our trips spanned everywhere between Idaho and California, and I know that I saw her at least once every trip from ages 5 to 8. As the chances of us coincidentally meeting so often without my mom noticing are very slim, I can only assume that there was something going on. I know that this could be a muddled memory and have generally ruled it out as one, but I have had many ghost experiences as a child that I hesitate to abandon entirely. Does anyone else have any similar experiences that might be related? If this kind woman is still helping wandering children keep their bellies warm, I would love to leave her a thank you on my next voyage. "10 years ago, when I was about 16, I started babysitting for a family that lived in my neighborhood. They had a sweet 7-month-old baby girl that I would babysit every now and then, and 2 dogs that were also very nice. Despite them having a nice house in a nice neighborhood, I still got a very weird feeling when I was in their home. It was almost like I was being watched or felt a presence there. Whenever I took care of the baby or their dogs, I would never want to spend longer there than needed. One night while babysitting her, about 2 years old, she asked to go down to their basement to play with Play-Doh. I said yes, and we went downstairs. I got a very weird feeling when we went down there, but I still got out the Play-Doh for her. We were playing for about 2 minutes before she came over to me and said that she was scared. I asked why she was scared, and she said that the man was scaring her. I said, "What?" Because I thought that I had heard her wrong the first time, and she said very clearly, "The man is scaring me." She then asked to go upstairs, and I said yes, and she bolted and ran up the stairs and left me to clean up the Play-Doh. About 6 months after that, the family asked me to care for the dogs while they were out of town, and I said yes. I ended up burning some sage and asking the spirit to leave the space. After that, I didn't feel the presence as strongly. It was to this day such a weird experience, and I still have no explanation for why that all happened. I went camping on a hiking trail in the Shawnee State Forest. During the day, I set up camp and went fishing in a creek running along next to the campsites. Most of the day, I felt fine and peaceful. I tend to feel at home in the woods alone and fly fishing. I started a fire, started on dinner over the fire before it got dark, and stoked the fire. Once it got dark, I felt compelled to keep the fire stoked, and a feeling of panic would set in if it even began to die down. I couldn't relax. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. It got to the point where I just grabbed my light and walked out, leaving all of my stuff there. I got out to the parking lot about 1.5 miles away and tried to steel my nerves and go back, but couldn't step past the tree line. I waited all the way until morning to go back to get my stuff, and the feeling was gone. I got everything together and left. Haven't been back since. I don't know if it was a ghost or a native spirit, since this place is deep in what used to be Shawnee tribe land. I was in a nearby abandoned Navy hospital with several friends. We had been in many times before and never had anything odd happen. We were on the top, the 3rd floor, and there were many broken windows, allowing the rain and nature in. There was a lot of mold and even moss growing in the old ceiling tiles that covered the floor at this point. One of our group, prone to asthma and respiratory issues, didn't take it too well. We all decided it was best to leave and began our descent into the basement, which was the route to the exit. This is when things got weird. I broke ahead of the group, something generally against our rules of exploring, but in my mind I had to get out. I was far enough ahead, around corners and such, that I couldn't even see their flashlights behind me anymore. My heart was racing, and I still don't know why. I finally got to the last door that led to the room that we would exit from. It was a heavier door that closed by itself. I reached for the doorknob, but something stopped me. I couldn't do it. Something in my mind wasn't letting me put my hand on the knob. All I felt was terror. I'm not sure how long I stood there, shaking with my hand no more than 3 inches away, before I saw the flashlights of my friends at the end of the hallway, and at last I could do it. I wrenched the door open and immediately went outside, hyperventilating with panic. My friends soon joined me, also saying something felt a little weird in there that time. We were gathering outside the door when the friend with the breathing issues felt something on her shoulder. We pulled down her shirt and there was a noticeable, quite obvious handprint. Nobody touched her, especially not hard enough to leave a full handprint through clothing. We've been back several times and haven't had another experience in any way, which only makes it even more odd, if you ask me. When I was young, I lived in a small, one-story house in a bad community a little ways south of Atlanta, Georgia. My parents bought the house when there were no other houses in the neighborhood, save for 1 or 2 neighbors that weren't exactly close enough to really be counted as proper neighbors. Well, by the time that I had come along and gotten old enough to play outside on my own, there were way more houses. It wasn't a huge neighborhood or anything, but it was way more built up than when my parents originally moved there. Behind my house, there were some woods. The woods were pretty dense, and went on for a few miles before there was a middle school and its football field. Sometimes at night, if it was clear, you could see the stadium lights glow way beyond the tree line. Anyways, in these woods I discovered a creek. My parents told me that when they first moved here, there were all sorts of fish and crawdads living in there. But when I first discovered the creek, I found nothing except for maybe a few tiny minnows. Maybe 5 or so spanning a mile, both up the creek from my house and down the creek. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't live in a very good area. The news was always talking about some shooting or drive-by, but where my neighborhood sat, it was usually more tame. This was in the early 2000s, and I didn't have internet or any sort of gaming console, but it was fine because I loved being outside anyways. Even if the mosquitoes were literally the worst, and I have a more severe allergic reaction to their bites. My favorite place to go and hide was out by the creek. But one time I went down, I remember seeing more vultures and scavenging birds flying around and sitting in the trees than normal. But no big deal. It was probably just a dead deer or something. I made my way to the creek and rolled up my jeans to stomp around in the water and kick up mud or whatever I used to do. But before I even finished rolling up my pants legs, I saw something. Still bent over, I was pretty close to a sickly pale, decently fresh-looking, human finger. It startled me for more than one reason, and I shot up like a rocket. There was nothing else around, though. No signs of other people, no blood, no body. Just a finger in the creek behind my house. It bothered me, but I was one of those weird, quiet kids, so it was a few months before I said anything. As it turns out, a few doors down there was a man hiding from the FBI in his sister's house. I never found out if he was an actual killer or anything, but I do remember waking up one night to see SWAT trucks and officers outside. One of the officers knocked on our door to ask my parents a few questions and to check to see if things were all right, and I remembered the finger. Of course, it was months later, so I doubted that it was still there and said nothing. I never heard anything else related to the guy or the FBI or the finger, but in my 8, maybe 9-year-old mind, it all seemed connected. And to this day, I'm pretty sure there was a murderer a few doors down from me when I was a kid. My birthday was on April 14th and I had just turned 12, so there were multiple balloons on the floor where this happened. It was around 3:30 a.m. on Sunday, and my family was asleep, but I was playing with my new birthday present, a Nintendo Switch, in my bedroom. I heard a loud pop sound coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a balloon, but louder and sort of more aggressive, if that makes sense. I put down my Nintendo Switch and told the girl that I was playing with that I would be right back. I opened my bedroom door and headed to the living room to explore the cause of this noise. I saw a deflated balloon in the same spot where it was earlier. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a misty white apparition in the shape of a woman, maybe about 4 feet tall, seated on my dad's sheepskin chair. I felt extremely cold, and an inexplicable feeling washed over me. The best way I can describe it is an overwhelming feeling of dread. I really wanted to go back to the safety of my own room, so I turned around and went back inside. I was playing with my friend and it was around 4:15 a.m. when I heard another noise coming from the living room. It was the sort of sound that you hear when something falls on glass but doesn't break it. Being scared as hell, I decided not to explore, as the sun was rising and I was getting ready for online school, and I go to the living room and the second noise happened. I see a framed picture lying face down on the ground. The picture is of my grandma who died in 2009, holding me as a baby. This happened when I was young, around 7 to 8 years old. I was napping in my room that I shared with my younger brothers. Our bedroom consisted of only 3 mattresses put on top of 2-inch wooden panels and a child-sized wardrobe. There was also a floor-to-ceiling window that was strictly for decoration and couldn't be opened. When I woke up from my nap, my babysitter, she was a live-in, was folding our clothes. I talked to her for a while, and then went out to get a water. I don't remember what, but I needed to talk to her after, so I went in again. But she wasn't there. I remember thinking that it was weird. There had been no sound of any closing or opening of doors in the 5 minutes when I had left the room to go get the water. I proceeded to ask every person in the house if they had seen her. None of them did. So I went inside the room for a second time, thinking maybe she somehow was just hiding for some reason. But I still couldn't find her. I went out again and searched the house, before eventually going back to the bedroom for a third time, and there she was, sitting in the bed, folding clothes like nothing had happened. I asked her where did she go. She replied, and I quote, "What are you talking about? I was here the whole time. I was shouting at you and asking you why you kept going in and out of the room, but you didn't answer me." She thought that I was pulling a prank on her, and I got reprimanded. There are still a couple of other incidents that happened around her, and to this day, I can't explain it at all. When I was a kid, I was with my family on a road trip a few hours away. We were driving down through a winding canyon, and it was dark. I was looking out my window, just staring at the dirt walls that we were passing. It was like the inside of cliffs on one side and forest on the other. Well, I was on the side of the car with the dirt hills and the cliff walls, and as we turned to go around a bend, I saw something human-shaped, which looked like it had a long, white face that resembled the Scream mask, hanging on the hillside. It happened so fast that it scared me to death nearly. I never said anything. I think it was because I wasn't sure what I had just seen, but I really don't think that it was a human being. This vivid memory is still clear as day. I spent the weekend camping throughout the Northeast, and all was very normal and quite nice. However, last night I camped in Massachusetts in a wooded area between Providence and Plymouth. Nothing felt negative, but I saw lights at least 3 times. The last time was just minutes ago, and that's what prompted me to write this. The lights are very quick, and almost out of the corner of my eye. I don't know what to say or quite how to describe it. I've never seen anything like it. And if it was paranormal, it was very clear. However, each time, they disappeared the second that I looked directly at them.